Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Sophia Turner stood at the edge of the dusty driveway, staring at the house before her. It was an odd place, both beautiful and unsettling, a large, Victorian-style home that seemed to sag under the weight of years. The paint on the trim had long faded to a dull gray, and ivy clung to the brick like a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around the windowsills. The roof had patches of missing shingles, and the front steps, worn by decades of use, creaked with every hesitant step she took toward the front door. She swallowed hard, brushing a lock of brown hair behind her ear as she glanced down at the envelope in her hands. The letter that had arrived last week had been unexpected, to say the least. Dear Sophia, it had begun, in her late grandmother's neat handwriting. I have left you my house and belongings. Please come and see it for yourself. Sophia hadn't even known her grandmother well. She had only met her once or twice as a child before the woman moved into the remote town of Marlow and cut all contact with the family. Her parents had said little about her, only that she was a strange and reclusive woman. Yet now, Sophia found herself standing before her grandmother's house, the key to the mystery of her inheritance sitting coldly in her palm. She hadn't wanted to come at first. The recent job loss, combined with the tension in her family, had made her feel like the last thing she needed was an old house full of memories she didn't understand. But something, an insistent pull, like a soft whisper in the back of her mind, had drawn her here. Maybe she just needed a change of scenery, or perhaps a new chapter. She walked up the steps, key clutched in hand, and reached for the old brass doorknob. It turned easily, the door creaking as it swung open, and she stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and something old, wood, mothballs, and memories. A chill settled around her shoulders as she crossed the threshold, a sense of abandonment wrapping itself around her like a thick fog. She looked around the entryway, wallpaper peeling at the edges, faded portraits of unknown faces hung on the walls, and the dim light from the overcast sky outside barely penetrated the gloom. A soft creak echoed from somewhere above her, but when she looked up, there was nothing. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the wind brushing against the windows. Sophia exhaled a shaky breath, forcing herself to move further into the house. She could feel the weight of years pressing down on her. This place was more than just a home. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. She set her suitcase down by the staircase and began exploring the first floor. The rooms were large but sparsely furnished, as though her grandmother hadn't bothered with comfort in her later years. The living room was dominated by a grand fireplace, its mantel lined with dusty trinkets, porcelain figurines, dried flowers, and a tarnished silver mirror that seemed to catch the faintest glimmer of the light. It wasn't until she entered the study at the far end of the hallway that she found something that made her stop in her tracks. On the desk in the center of the room sat an old phonograph. The black wooden frame was intricately carved with faded gold accents along its edges. Its horn, once gleaming, was now a dull brass, coated in a layer of dust. A stack of vinyl records lay beside it, each one labeled in elegant, cursive handwriting. The labels were faded, but a few of the names still stood out. Thomas, Eliza, and Margaret. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Margaret? That was her grandmother's name. Curious, she picked up the first record in the pile, one labeled Thomas. She placed it on the turntable and gently lowered the needle, watching as the record spun slowly, the hiss of static filling the room. At first, there was nothing, just the crackling sound of an old record player struggling to make the music work. But then, faintly, a voice began to emerge from the speakers. "Hello," the voice said, low and distorted. "I'm Thomas, and I." The words broke off abruptly, followed by a loud scraping sound. Sophia froze, her hand hovering above the phonograph. The voice didn't sound like a recording. It sounded real, like someone had spoken directly into the machine, their voice trapped within the grooves of the record. She leaned in closer, straining to hear more, but the voice fell silent again, replaced by the soft static. She hesitated before lifting the needle and placing it on another record. This one was labeled Eliza. She wasn't sure why she was compelled to do it. Maybe it was her natural curiosity, or perhaps something in the house was calling her to listen. Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that the voices on these records were meant for her to hear. As the second record began to play, Eliza's voice came through clearly, though still faint. "My name is Eliza," the voice whispered, trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. There was something desperate about the tone. Eliza's voice seemed to break, as if she were on the verge of tears. "I was trapped here, just like the others. Please don't listen to the others. If you hear them, they'll find you. They'll..." The record stopped abruptly, the needle scratching against the vinyl, as if someone had violently pulled it away. Sophia stumbled back, her heart racing. What was this? Why would her grandmother have kept records like this? And who were these people? She couldn't make sense of it. Was this some kind of twisted family project, a way for her grandmother to communicate with the dead? Before she could think further, a cold draft swept through the room, chilling her to the bone. She turned around, heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no cause for the sudden drop in temperature. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like a breath brushing against her ear. Sophia. Her body stiffened, her pulse thudding in her temples. The voice was so soft, almost as if it was coming from the other side of the house. But there was no one there. Her mind raced. Was it just the wind? The house settling? Or had she heard something real? Something alive? As the whisper faded, a sudden weight seemed to press down on her chest. This house was no ordinary place, and the records, their eerie voices, were only the beginning of something much darker. Sophia stood frozen in the study, the eerie whisper still lingering in her mind. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, each pulse a loud reminder that she was alone in this creaky old house, surrounded by the ghosts of its past. Her hands trembled as she set the record back on the desk. The silence felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a decision. She looked at the phonograph, its dark, brass horns seeming to glare back at her accusingly. "Get a grip, Sophia," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to breathe deeply. "It's just an old house. It's just an old machine." She needed answers. Why would my grandmother leave me this place? She thought, looking around the study. Her grandmother had never been someone to share personal details with the family, especially not Sophia. She had always been a shadow, a distant figure who rarely made an appearance at family gatherings. Now, standing in her grandmother's house, Sophia wondered if maybe there had been a reason for the silence, a reason she hadn't been privy to. She glanced at the other records scattered across the desk. They were all labeled with names she didn't recognize. Clara Edward Gerald. The names seemed to haunt the air, as though they carried weight beyond the ink used to write them. Sophia ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing. Maybe the voices on the records were just some old family project, something her grandmother had done to occupy her time in the final years of her life. Perhaps there was some logical explanation for everything. But then, why did the voices sound so real? Why had she heard one call her name? A sudden coldness swept over her again, more intense this time, and she shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. There was something off about the atmosphere in the house, like the air was charged with something that didn't belong, something that had been buried for far too long. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud thump from upstairs, followed by a low creaking noise. She flinched, her heart lurching into her throat. The house was old, that was true, but that sound. It wasn't just the house settling. Sophia took a tentative step toward the door, drawn to the stairs as though something were calling her from above. She hesitated. Was she really going to go up there? To face whatever might be lurking in the shadows? It was only the first day. There was no reason to dive headfirst into whatever strange history her grandmother had left behind. But as she turned to leave the study, the sound came again, louder this time, followed by what almost sounded like soft footsteps pacing back and forth in the hall above her. A chill ran down her spine. It was then that she realized it wasn't just the house that was unsettled, it was something inside of it. Something that was very much aware of her presence. Before she could think better of it, Sophia found herself walking toward the staircase, her feet carrying her forward as if guided by some unseen force. The staircase creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, each step sending a soft groan through the old wood. The house felt alive, groaning and shifting, as if it were waking up after years of slumber. Sophia's footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway at the top of the stairs. It was too quiet, too still. At the end of the hallway stood a door, its edges worn and splintered, the wood so old it looked as though it might crumble at a touch. The door that led to the attic. The thumping noises had stopped, but she felt an unshakable pull to the attic, as though something there was waiting for her. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to stop investigating, but her feet carried her forward, and she reached for the door handle without hesitation. It was cold to the touch. The door swung open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading up to the attic. A heavy layer of dust hung in the air, and the smell of age and neglect wafted down to her like the stench of forgotten memories. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the steep stairs ahead of her. With a deep breath, Sophia began her ascent, each step slow and cautious. The attic, she knew, was where her grandmother had spent most of her time. The rest of the house seemed abandoned, but the attic had always been the heart of her reclusiveness. What would she find up there? The final step creaked as Sophia reached the top, and she stepped into the attic. It was exactly as she had imagined, dusty, cluttered, and claustrophobic. Old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly in every corner, and old trunks that seemed to hold decades of forgotten possessions. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and cobwebs clung to the wooden beams above. But what caught her eye immediately wasn't the clutter. It was the large, ornate mirror that stood against the far wall, its reflective surface darkened with grime and age. It was a full-length mirror with an intricate golden frame that seemed out of place amidst the decay of the attic. Sophia felt drawn to it. She didn't know why, but something about the mirror called to her. She took a hesitant step forward, the dust on the floor crunching beneath her shoes. Her reflection appeared faintly in the mirror's surface, distorted by the grime, but it was still there. She moved closer, brushing her fingers across the glass. As she did, she felt a strange sensation, as though the mirror was not simply reflecting her, but somehow watching her. She jerked her hand back, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Sophia. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as though it were right behind her. Sophia spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. The attic was empty. The mirror, however, seemed to shimmer for just a moment, as if responding to her unease. It was then that she noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror, there was a shadow behind her. No one had been there a moment ago. The figure was faint, but unmistakable. A man. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his presence was undeniable. The whisper came again, this time louder, Sophia. She gasped, backing away from the mirror. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The reflection of the man lingered for a moment longer, his shadow stretching across the floor as if it had a life of its own. But when she turned to run, the figure was gone. Her breathing was ragged as she stumbled back toward the stairs. She could feel her legs trembling, but she refused to let fear take control. There was something in this house, something that had been waiting for her, and it was far from finished. Sophia didn't sleep that night. The event in the attic replayed over and over in her mind, each time more vivid than the last. The whisper calling her name, the shadow in the mirror, her heart pounded just thinking about it. She kept the light on, staring at the ceiling, trying to push aside the feeling that the house was watching her. The floorboards creaked faintly in the distance, and every now and then, she thought she could hear soft whispers on the edge of hearing, as if the walls themselves were murmuring. It wasn't just the old house settling, it was something else. Something alive. The next morning, the sun barely pierced the clouds, casting a dim, gray light through the curtained windows. The house was silent for now, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. Waiting for something. Or someone. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The phonograph, the records, she had to find out what was happening. After a restless night, she made her way back to the study. The phonograph sat on the desk, silent for now, but the stack of records remained, still haunting her with their strange, cryptic labels. She had to know more. Who were these people? What did they want from her? Her eyes were drawn again to the record labeled Sophia. Her heart lurched. It was impossible, wasn't it? How could a record with her name on it be in her grandmother's house, in a stack of old records that had clearly been here for decades? She reached for the record, trembling as her fingers brushed the smooth surface. She was afraid to play it, afraid of what it might reveal, but she couldn't stop herself. Her hand hovered over the phonograph, and then she set the record down, the label facing up. Slowly, she lowered the needle. The soft hiss of static filled the air, but then a voice came through, faint at first, as though it were struggling to break through the noise. Sophia. The voice was deep, distorted, but unmistakably hers. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded like her, but it was warped, twisted in a way that made her stomach churn. Sophia, you don't know. You don't understand. The words were broken, as though the speaker was gasping for air. Sophia leaned in closer, her hands shaking. What was happening? Her name, her voice, coming from the past, from somewhere unknown. Get out. Get out while you can. Or they will. The record stopped abruptly, the needle scratching against the vinyl as the room was plunged back into silence. Sophia froze, her mind racing. Her own voice warning her. Her heart hammered in her chest. The voice was coming from the past, wasn't it? That was the only explanation. But why was her name on the record? And why was it warning her? She had to know more. Sophia spent the rest of the day searching the house. She rummaged through old boxes in the attic, looking for any clue that could explain what was happening. There was an old trunk in the corner of the attic, half hidden behind a stack of discarded furniture. She pried it open, dust billowing into the air, and found it filled with old books, photographs, and papers, tattered and yellowed with age. One photograph caught her eye. It was a black and white photo of a man and woman, standing together on the steps of a house that looked almost identical to the one she was in now. The woman looked strikingly like her grandmother, young and beautiful, but with an intensity in her eyes that made Sophia uneasy. The man beside her had dark, sharp features, and his eyes seemed to stare right through the lens. On the back of the photo was a single word, Marlowe. Marlowe? Was it the town where the house was? It had to be, but why did the photo feel so important? She flipped through the rest of the trunk's contents, but nothing seemed to make sense. There were more photos, some with familiar faces, others with people she didn't recognize. There were letters too, old and yellowed, but none of them explained anything about the strange happenings or the records. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she returned to the study, her mind still racing. The house felt heavier now, the shadows longer. As she sat down at the desk, the phonograph seemed to call to her, its presence almost palpable. Her fingers hovered over the remaining records. She picked up the one labeled Eliza. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she placed it onto the turntable. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing her to these records, that the voices wanted something from her. But what? The needle touched the vinyl. and the familiar hiss filled the room. Then, Eliza's voice returned, trembling and faint. I was wrong. I should never have listened to her. I should never have agreed. Sophia leaned in closer, her pulse quickening. The voice sounded desperate, frantic. They will find you. They will come for you. There's no escape from the house. She bound us here. She made a deal. Eliza's voice trembled, as though she were fighting to speak, to break free from some unseen force. You don't understand. The deal. The pact. It was with him. With the man in the photo. Sophia's breath hitched. The man in the photo? You're in danger. She never wanted to let us go. She wanted us to stay here. Forever. The record screeched and stopped. The needle jumped, scratching across the vinyl before it went silent. Sophia's mind was reeling. The man in the photograph, the deal, her grandmother. Had she trapped these people here? Were their souls bound to the house? She couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something terrible here, something dark, and it was all connected to the house and its past. She needed to find out what happened. She needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. The next morning, Sophia dug deeper into the study. She searched the bookshelves, the drawers, every crevice of the room. She knew there had to be something here that explained it all. And then, hidden behind a row of dusty books, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal. It was her grandmother's handwriting, but this time, the entries weren't as neat. They were frantic, rushed, almost as if her grandmother had written them in a state of panic. January 12th, 1947. The phonograph is working. The voices, so many voices. I can hear them speaking to me. They beg for release, but I am not sure I can trust them. Some of them are familiar, but others are strangers. They tell me things I don't want to know. January 15th, 1947. I made a deal. I had no choice. They were going to take me if I didn't. The man, he promised me power. He promised me control over the house, over everything. But now I see the cost. The voices. They're becoming stronger, more insistent. I don't think I can stop it. Sophia's hands shook as she turned the pages. Her grandmother had made a deal. A deal with the man in the photo. But what had she agreed to? And what price had she paid? There was so much more to uncover, but Sophia knew one thing for certain now. The house was alive, and it was feeding on the souls trapped within it. But was she the next one to be claimed? Sophia barely slept that night, her mind racing with the revelations from her grandmother's journal. The more she learned, the less she understood. A deal, a pact with someone or something in exchange for power. Was it the origin of the house's strange atmosphere? The voices on the records, the shadows in the mirrors, the unsettling whispers. Had they all been tied to this man in the photograph? Who was he? What had he promised her grandmother? And at what cost? The next day, she returned to the attic. The trunk and its contents had sparked too many questions to ignore. She needed more answers. Answers that could explain her grandmother's obsession with the house and the unnatural hold it seemed to have on her. The attic was colder this time, as though the air had thickened overnight, heavy with the secrets it guarded. Sophia felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, but she couldn't turn back now. She had already come too far. The photograph of the man still haunted her thoughts. She needed to know who he was and why he had been so important to her grandmother. She carefully pulled out the stack of papers again, rifling through them one by one. A few minutes later, she found something new, a faded letter crumpled and yellowed with age, tucked in between the pages of an old book. The letter was addressed to someone named Edward Marlowe. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were urgent, frantic even. The letter seemed to be written by her grandmother. Edward, I know what you are offering, but I cannot accept the price. I feel the darkness growing stronger with each passing day. My mind is unraveling, and I fear that I may not be able to hold on much longer. You promised me power, but it is not what I seek anymore. It is too much. The house, the voices, They are taking over me, and I fear I will lose myself to them. I beg of you, find a way to undo the pact. But you warn me that such things are never simple. That once the deal has been made, there is no going back. You are right. The power has consumed me. It consumes everything. It is only a matter of time before the house claims me fully. Please, Edward, I hope it is not too late. The letter ended there abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest. Edward Marlowe, that was the man in the photograph, the one who had been standing beside her grandmother. And the pact, the deal her grandmother had made, it had something to do with him, and something to do with the house. Her grandmother had tried to break free from the deal, but the letter made it clear, once the pact had been sealed, there was no turning back. The house, the voices, the spirits trapped within its walls, they were all part of it. Part of the price. But why had her grandmother been so desperate to undo it? What had Edward Marlowe promised her? And how did all of this tie to Sophia? The question spun in her mind like a whirlwind, and she had to know more. As night fell, the house seemed to shift again. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavier, the shadows growing longer, and the silence stretching deeper. Sophia couldn't ignore it anymore. The house was alive, and it was growing restless. She returned to the study, the place where everything had begun, and stared at the phonograph. The records lay in front of her, each one a mystery, each one a puzzle piece she couldn't quite fit. The voices were calling her, urging her to listen, but she knew there was something more, something crucial she hadn't found yet. As she sifted through the records once again, one in particular caught her attention, Clara. She hadn't played that one yet. A strange feeling washed over her as she picked it up, her fingers almost shaking as she set it on the turntable. The hiss of static filled the room, and then a voice broke through, the voice of a woman. "Clara, is that you?" Sophia froze, her blood running cold. It was her grandmother's voice, but younger, softer, almost like a whisper. "Clara, you must listen. The man, Edward, he has changed. The power is corrupting him. It's too late for me, but you mustn't fall into the same trap." The voice quivered, the words desperate. "The house, it has a hold on him. A hold on all of us. You have to find a way to destroy it before it consumes us all. Before it consumes you." The record cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackling static behind. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the voice, of her grandmother's plea, hanging in the air like a specter. The urgency in the words was unmistakable. Her grandmother had known the danger, and now it seemed like she was passing the warning on to Sophia. She needed to find a way to break the house's grip, to undo whatever had been done. But how? The next morning, Sophia ventured down to the basement. It had been the one part of the house she hadn't explored yet, and something told her that the answer she sought would be there. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a strange compulsion to find the truth in the basement. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, the air thick with the musty smell of old stone and damp wood. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the low, flickering light from a single bulb cast eerie shadows across the walls. Shelves lined with forgotten relics and objects she didn't recognize filled the space. But one thing stood out to her, a large, rusted door at the far end of the room. It was locked. Her heart skipped a beat. This had to be it. This had to be the door that held the secret to everything. Sophia found a crowbar lying against one of the shelves and used it to pry open the rusted lock. With a loud screech, the door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. Inside, there was a wooden chest, massive and ancient, its surface worn with age and covered in dust. The air around it felt wrong. It was as though something had been trapped in there for far too long. With trembling hands, Sophia opened the chest. Inside, there was a single item, an ornate key, old and heavy, its intricate design glinting in the low light. The key was cold to the touch, and a sense of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. She knew instinctively that this was the key to the house, the key that could unlock its dark secrets. But the question was, what would it unlock? Sophia stood before the key, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. Everything she had learned so far, the voices, the records, her grandmother's journal, the man in the photo, had led her to this moment. The key was the answer, the missing piece of the puzzle. But what would happen if she used it? With a deep breath, she walked back up the stairs, holding the key tightly in her hand. The house felt different now, heavier, like it was waiting for her to make her move. As she approached the front door, she could almost hear the whispers in the walls, urging her forward. She inserted the key into the door's lock, her hands trembling. The lock clicked, and the door slowly creaked open. On the other side, the darkness stretched out before her. And in that darkness, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like something was coming for her. The house had been waiting for her, and now she had no choice but to face whatever it was that had been lurking in its shadows for all these years. The key felt unnaturally cold in Sophia's hand as she stood before the now unlocked door. A deep, foreboding hum vibrated in the air, as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting, anticipating. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, pounding against the silence that enveloped the house. She hesitated for a moment, but the pull of whatever lay beyond was too strong. She stepped forward. The door creaked open, and a chill ran through her as she crossed the threshold. On the other side was a hallway, unlike anything she had seen before in the house. It stretched endlessly, lined with dark wooden panels that seemed to shift in the dim light, like the walls themselves were moving. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else too, a suffocating sense of being watched. Sophia could almost feel eyes on her, hidden in the shadows. She took a step forward, then another, her breath coming faster now. The floor beneath her feet creaked, but it wasn't the usual creaking she had grown used to. This was different, deeper. The house was alive. It was aware of her presence. The hallway seemed to stretch out forever, the walls warping and twisting as though they were shifting, rearranging themselves in the dark. It felt as though the passage was endless. Every door she passed was tightly shut, but there was one at the far end of the hall, faintly glowing from beneath, that called to her. She had to know what was behind it. She had to know what the house was hiding. Sophia finally reached the door. It was old, the wood dark and chipped, with intricate carvings running along its edges. She hesitated before placing the key into the lock. Her hand trembled as she turned the key, and the door creaked open, revealing a small room that was unlike any other she had encountered in the house. The room was circular, with no windows and only a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its frame gilded and covered in strange symbols. The glass was dark, almost reflective, but it felt off, like it was more than just a mirror. Sophia's heart raced as she stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The temperature dropped. She could feel the presence of something old, ancient, and powerful in the room with her. The walls seemed to close in around her, the dark symbols on the mirror's frame glowing faintly, as though the house was responding to her presence. She looked into the mirror. At first, it was just her reflection. Her tired eyes, her pale face, nothing unusual. But then the reflection began to shift. Her image blurred, and a figure appeared behind her. A man. The same man from the photograph. Edward Marlowe. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. He was standing behind her, his eyes locked onto hers through the glass. He didn't move. He just stared, a faint smirk on his lips, his eyes dark and unblinking. "You found it," his voice echoed, coming from the mirror itself, deep and haunting. "The key. It's only the beginning. You don't understand what you've uncovered, do you?" Sophia stepped back, her pulse racing. She didn't know what to say. This was impossible. This man, this thing, was in the mirror, and it was speaking to her. "I've been waiting," he continued, his voice lowering to a chilling whisper. "Waiting for someone like you. Someone who will unlock the truth of this house and take its place. Sophia stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The house, waiting for her? She had come here to uncover the truth, to break whatever hold this house had on her, but now it felt as though it was all drawing her in. The truth wasn't freeing, it was a trap. Sophia felt her knees weaken as she stumbled away from the mirror. The oppressive weight of the room seemed to crush down on her, and the whispers, faint at first, grew louder, more urgent. Her grandmother's voice, Eliza's voice, Clara's voice, all of them, calling out to her from the darkness. Don't listen to him. He is the one who bound us here. The house will take you. It will consume your soul, just as it did ours. Sophia clutched her head, the voices ringing in her ears, the pressure building, until she felt like she was drowning in it. She had to get out of the room. She had to escape. But the door had closed behind her, and the lock had snapped shut with a loud click. She was trapped. A low laugh echoed from the mirror, and the figure of Edward Marlowe shifted slightly. He took a step forward, his cold gaze never leaving her. You can't escape it, Sophia, he said, his voice now full of malice. It's already too late. You've already made the choice by unlocking the door. The house will take you as it took me, as it took all of us. You are bound to it now. Sophia's mind reeled, the reality of his words sinking in. The house had been waiting for her all along. The deal her grandmother had made, the pact with Edward Marlowe, it wasn't just about power. It was about binding souls to the house, to the land itself. And now, it seemed, it was her turn. The air around her felt thick with an unnatural energy, and the house seemed to shift once again. The walls groaned, and the light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The house wasn't just alive, it was alive with hunger. And now, Sophia realized with growing horror, she was its prey. Edward's smirk twisted into something darker, more sinister. Don't you see? I didn't just offer your grandmother power, he continued, his form flickering like a shadow in the mirror. I gave her a way to escape the house's hunger, to survive in its presence. But only by feeding it more souls. And now it wants you. Sophia's throat went dry, her pulse racing. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. Her grandmother had sacrificed the lives of others, trapped souls, to maintain her own. She had bound them to the house, and now, those trapped souls were reaching out to her, hoping to warn her, hoping to save her. But it was too late. Edward stepped closer, his smile widening. Welcome to your fate, Sophia. The house is hungry, and you've just become its next meal. Sophia's breath quickened, panic rising in her chest. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle, to stop the house from consuming her as it had consumed so many before. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching for anything that might help her. The mirror was glowing now, the symbols on its frame pulsing with energy. She couldn't look at it any longer. She turned her back to the glass and stumbled toward the door, but it was no use. She was trapped. It's time. Edward's voice rang out again, cold and final. You've entered the heart of the house, and now it's time to become part of it. Sophia closed her eyes, trying to block out his voice, the whispers, the darkness. But she knew that the house wouldn't let her go. It never let anyone go. The house had already claimed her. Sophia's heart thundered in her chest as she turned around, her back pressed against the cold, unyielding door. The air seemed to thicken, and the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her, its grip tightening as though it were trying to pull her in, swallow her whole. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to undo the nightmare she had unwittingly stepped into. There's no escape, Edward's voice echoed, but this time there was a hint of something else, a flicker of regret, maybe, in the way he spoke. I know what you're trying to do. You think you can outsmart the house, but it's been waiting for you. All of us, your grandmother, Clara, we were all just pawns. Now, It's your turn to pay the price." Sophia's eyes darted around the room, her mind searching for any clue, any sign that she could break free. Her fingers brushed against the walls, the strange symbols etched deep into the wood. They felt cold, ancient. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, the plea to find a way to destroy the house before it consumed her. She wasn't sure how, but she knew that destroying the mirror might be her only hope. The mirror was a conduit. She could feel it. If it had been the means through which the house had trapped Edward and the others, maybe it could work the other way too. But how to destroy it? The symbols were so intricate, so complicated. What if they held the key to the mirror's power? Sophia stepped closer to the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold emanating from the glass, the sinister pull of the house's hunger. Edward's face flickered in the reflection, his grin widening as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You think you can destroy it?" Edward's voice was almost mocking now. "The house gave me power, but it demands a price. And you, Sophia, are its next sacrifice. You cannot destroy what feeds you." Sophia didn't listen. She couldn't. The desperation inside her had taken over, and she had no choice but to try. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. The symbols on the frame seemed to shift, moving beneath her touch like living things. Her breath caught as she felt a surge of energy course through her arm, making her whole body tremble. The mirror was reacting to her touch. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, distorting the reflection. She gasped, her fingers tingling with an odd, electric sensation. The mirror was alive. "Stop!" Edward's voice was growing frantic now, his form becoming distorted, flickering in and out of existence. "You don't know what you're doing. You're unleashing something worse." Sophia didn't stop. She pressed harder against the mirror, the symbols on the frame glowing brighter with every second. The coldness of the mirror seeped into her bones, and she felt something shift inside her. It was as if she were pulling at the very essence of the house, unraveling its dark threads. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror was still, but then the glass cracked. The sound was deafening, like the breaking of 1,000 bones. Sophia staggered back as shards of glass splintered outward, the dark energy that had been contained inside exploding into the room. A dark, suffocating force filled the air, and the house groaned, its walls trembling in response. Edward's form twisted violently in the reflection, his face contorted in pain, rage, and terror. "No! You've killed me, you fool!" he screamed, his voice twisting into something unrecognizable. "You've released it, released him." As the mirror shattered, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls cracked, the floor split open, and the house began to scream, a terrible, high-pitched sound that rattled the very foundations of the building. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed, as though they were alive, reaching for her, trying to drag her into the abyss. Sophia stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. The shattered pieces of glass littered the floor, glistening like broken teeth. But it wasn't the glass that caught her attention. It was the darkness that was now spilling out from the cracks in the walls, the deep, unnatural void that seemed to pulse and breathe. She could hear something ancient breathing from within the walls. It was alive. It had been alive all along. And now it was free. Suddenly, the darkness surged forward, coalescing into a form. A shape, a figure. The ground beneath Sophia's feet cracked wide open, and from the depths of the house, something vast and monstrous began to rise. A shadowed, hulking form, towering and grotesque, its face obscured by the blackness of its own being. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned with an unearthly light, glowing like embers in a furnace. The house itself seemed to bow to the creature, as though it were its master. It was the true heart of the house, the thing that had been feeding on souls for centuries, the thing that had bound Edward, her grandmother, and all the others to its will. Sophia gasped as the creature's attention turned toward her. The darkness around her seemed to thicken, wrapping around her, pulling her closer to the beast. She could feel its cold breath, the overwhelming weight of its presence pressing down on her chest. "You are the last." The creature's voice was a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the room like thunder. "The house has given you everything. Now, it will take what it is owed." The room was suffocating. The air was thick with the weight of the beast's presence, the shadows growing long and dark, stretching towards Sophia like grasping hands. The house was alive, and it was hungrier than ever. Sophia's legs trembled beneath her, and she felt her body instinctively take a step back. But there was no place to hide. The beast was everywhere. It was the house itself. She couldn't escape. Not now. But there was one thing she could do. The key to the house. The thing that had unlocked everything. It was still in her pocket. She reached for it, her hand shaking. The cold metal felt strangely comforting against her palm. The key that had opened the door to this nightmare. The key that could seal it. Her grandmother had left a message. Find the key, break the pact, destroy the house. She didn't fully understand it, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the only way to end it. Sophia stepped forward, holding the key tightly in her hand, and faced the dark entity. The beast seemed to sense what she was about to do, its form rippling with anger. Its burning eyes locked onto hers, and it snarled, a deep, rumbling growl that shook the walls. "You cannot stop me," it hissed. "You will join me like all the others." But Sophia was already moving, her mind set on her goal. She walked toward the center of the room, the key clutched in her hand. The house groaned as though it was in pain, the shadows retreating just slightly from the force of her determination. "I will stop you," she whispered. With a final, resolute movement, she drove the key into the center of the dark creature's chest. The moment the key made contact with the creature's chest, the house itself seemed to scream. The walls quaked, the floor buckled beneath her feet, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay and desperation. The darkness surrounding her pulsed violently, as though the very essence of the house was fighting to keep its hold on her. For a moment, everything was still. The creature's burning eyes locked onto Sophia's, its form beginning to ripple as if the key had pierced a part of its soul. It let out a guttural growl, its body shuddering with a violent tremor. Then, with a sound like 1,000 bones snapping at once, the creature began to collapse inward, the darkness bleeding away in thick waves, twisting into the shape of a vortex. Sophia stumbled back, her breath ragged as she tried to keep her footing. The key was still lodged within the beast, but now the house seemed to be unraveling, the walls cracking open, the floor splitting apart as if the very foundation of its existence was being torn apart. The light in the room flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that danced and warped like specters of the past. The house groaned in agony, its twisted, ancient voice echoing through the collapsing halls. "You cannot undo what is done. I am eternal, bound to this land, to the souls it has consumed. You cannot destroy me." But Sophia's resolve only hardened. She knew this was her only chance. She had to destroy the heart of the house, no matter the cost. The key began to glow with an intense light, the darkness surrounding it growing unstable. The walls trembled violently, and the creature's form began to disintegrate, its flesh melting away into smoke and ash. As it dissolved, the shadows began to retreat, drawing back into the cracks and crevices of the house as though they were being sucked into a void. Sophia's chest tightened, her vision growing blurry as the air became thick with energy. The house was fighting, its grip on her tightening with every second. She could feel the pull of its hunger, its insatiable desire to consume her, to take her soul just as it had done with Edward, her grandmother, and countless others before them. The creature's voice grew more frantic, its words warping with desperation. "You think you've won, but you have only set in motion your own demise. The house will never let you go. I am part of it, and it is part of me." Sophia's fingers tightened around the key. She could feel the power of it, the power to break the pact, to sever the house's hold on her, to end the nightmare once and for all. But it wasn't enough to simply defeat the creature. She had to sever the connection between the house and everything it had consumed. The darkness, the spirits, it all had to be undone. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward towards the center of the room where the house's heart had once stood. She could feel the key vibrating in her hand, pulsing with the energy of the house, as if it were responding to her. It was almost like the house was aware of what she was doing, trying to stop her, clawing at her from every direction. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't fail. With a final breath, she raised the key above her head, the light from it shining brighter than anything she had ever seen. The house screamed one last time, the sound of its pain reverberating through her very bones. And then she drove the key into the ground. There was a deafening crash as the earth trembled beneath her feet. The key sank into the foundation of the house, glowing brighter and brighter until it burst in a brilliant flash of light. When the light faded, everything was silent. Sophia opened her eyes, unsure of what to expect. The house, which had been alive with tension and darkness moments ago, was now eerily still. The air was thick, but there was a strange sense of relief, as if the house had finally exhaled. The shadows had receded, the oppressive weight that had clung to her was gone, and the house no longer felt like it was breathing. It was empty. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to stand, her body trembling with exhaustion. She could still hear the faint echoes of the house's anguish, but they were distant now, fading. As she turned to leave, the room behind her seemed to dissolve, the walls crumbling and peeling away as though they had never existed. The door that had once been locked, the one that had led her to this nightmare, was gone. In its place, there was nothing, just an open sky. Sophia took a shaky breath, stepping forward into the light. Days passed before Sophia returned to the world outside the house. The remnants of the nightmare seemed to blur with every passing hour, as though it had been a distant memory, a dream that slipped through her fingers. She returned to the city, but the weight of the house's presence still lingered in the back of her mind. But the house was gone now. The place where it had stood was nothing but a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. It was as if it had never existed. Sophia stood at the edge of the lot, looking out at the place where her nightmare had started. She felt a strange calm, the peace of knowing that the cycle had ended. The house was no longer a part of her life, no longer a part of the world. She had faced the darkness, fought it, and survived. But she knew there was always more. The house may be gone, but there were other places, other creatures, other forces lurking in the dark corners of the world. And maybe one day, she would have to face them too. But not today. Today, Sophia was free. Sophia's return to the world outside the house didn't bring the kind of peace she had hoped for. The memories of what she had endured were still fresh, haunting her with every step she took. It was as if the house had left a permanent mark on her soul, one that couldn't be washed away, no matter how hard she tried. She found herself walking the streets aimlessly, her mind drifting back to the house. The destruction of the creature, the key that had freed her, it all felt too simple in hindsight. The relief had been short-lived. The echoes of the house's darkness still whispered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. The house was gone, but something had changed within her. The knowledge of the darkness, the awareness of its existence, had carved a new path for her, one she wasn't sure she was ready to follow. She'd been given freedom, but at what cost? Days after her return, when Sophia thought she had finally begun to settle into the mundanity of her life again, she received a letter. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, the handwriting on it unfamiliar. It was addressed simply to her name, no return address, no hint of who could have sent it. She sat down at her kitchen table, the hairs on the back of her neck rising as she opened it with trembling hands. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper. The words written on it were simple but chilling. You have not escaped. The house remembers you, and you are not alone. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was her grandmother's. The pact was never broken. The house is not dead, only dormant. The words sent a chill through her, deep into her bones. Her mind raced. Was this another trick? Or was it a warning? She had destroyed the creature, shattered the mirror, and torn apart the house's hold on her. Yet this letter suggested otherwise. What had she missed? What had she failed to understand? The days that followed were marked by a deep unease. Sophia couldn't shake the letter's warning, its words lingering in the back of her mind. She tried to go on with her life, tried to forget about the house, but the world around her seemed to shift. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. Every corner she turned, every reflection she caught in a window or mirror, made her heart race with a sense of impending dread. Something was following her. She felt it in the air, in the chill that clung to her skin, in the way the world around her seemed to distort when she wasn't paying attention. And then one night it happened again. Sophia was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when she heard it. A faint tapping at the window. It was soft at first, like the faint rattle of a branch against the glass, but then it grew louder, more insistent, until it was unmistakable. A voice, barely audible, whispered from the darkness outside. "Sophia, come to me." Her heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to the window, her breath shallow and fast. But when she looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the quiet night. She turned away, but the whisper continued, growing louder with each passing moment. "You belong to me, Sophia. You cannot hide." The voice wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, distorted. Her blood ran cold as the shadows in the room seemed to shift, to reach toward her. Sophia's mind spun. Was this a hallucination? Was the house truly gone? Or had she merely postponed the inevitable? Days passed, and the whispers didn't stop. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear them, muffled at first, but then growing louder. She tried to block them out, tried to ignore them, but the truth was undeniable. The house's grip was still there, tightening slowly around her. One night, when she could no longer bear the haunting whispers, Sophia went to the library. She couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. She needed answers. Hours passed as she searched through old books and journals, scouring every record she could find about the house, the creature, and its history. It was then that she came across something, a journal that belonged to her grandmother, a record of all the strange rituals and dark pacts that had been made over the years. As she read, a cold chill settled over her. Her grandmother had known the truth. The house was not simply a place of terror. It was a nexus of power, a living entity that could never truly be destroyed. The creature, the one she had fought, was only a manifestation of the house's hunger, its need to feed. And worse, her grandmother had been bound to it. Not just as a victim, but as a willing participant. The pact that had been made had been forged with her blood. And when Sophia had thought she had broken it, she realized with growing horror that it wasn't the creature that was the heart of the house. It was the pact itself. The house had no master, no single being that controlled it. It was an endless cycle, feeding on souls and drawing power from the living, consuming them until there was nothing left. And once you were marked, once you knew the truth, there was no escaping it. Sophia's world twisted around her as she pieced together the horrifying reality of what she had unleashed. The house hadn't been destroyed. It had merely shifted, slipped beneath the surface, biding its time. The darkness had been released, but it was not gone. As she closed the journal, her blood ran cold. A single phrase stood out above all others. Only when the last soul is taken will the house find peace. She had been marked as one of the house's chosen, its final victim. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how much she fought, the house would follow. There was no escaping it. The sky outside grew dark, heavy clouds gathering, as if the world itself knew what was about to happen. Sophia stood alone in the center of her apartment, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The whispers had grown louder, the shadows had grown longer, and she knew, deep down, that the house was calling her back. It was not done with her, not by a long shot. She had been given a choice, a chance to break the cycle, but the cost was far greater than she had anticipated. To truly end the house's reign, she would have to offer herself, willingly, as the final sacrifice. But was she willing to pay that price? Sophia had thought she had found freedom, thought she had escaped the darkness. But she was wrong. The house never let go. It had always been waiting for her to return. And now, with the choice before her, she had to decide. Would she accept the house's call and sacrifice herself to end it once and for all? Or would she face an eternity of suffering, knowing that the house would never truly die? The decision was hers to make. Sophia sat in the center of her apartment, the journal resting on her lap. Its pages seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. The words she had read echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again. Only when the last soul is taken will the house find peace. But she didn't have the luxury of time to think it through. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, crawling in her mind like insects burrowing beneath her skin. Her grandmother's warning was crystal clear now. The house was alive in ways she hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just a haunted house, a place where dark deeds had been committed. It was a being, a living entity with desires and intentions. It was sentient and it knew her name. The moment Sophia had broken the creature's hold, the house had only shifted, as if retreating into itself, preparing for a new phase. And she realized with growing horror that the darkness, the evil that had haunted her for so long, had merely been lying dormant, waiting for her to return to it. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed the journal once more, her eyes skimming across the pages in frantic haste. Her grandmother's notes, filled with ancient rituals and cryptic symbols, were now even more ominous. One phrase, buried near the end, caught her eye. The house feeds on the souls it has claimed, but it is never full. The final offering, the one that will end its hunger forever, must come from the one who knows the truth. Sophia's heart stopped. She had been marked. She wasn't just a victim of the house, she was its final sacrifice. The truth she had uncovered, the key to its destruction, was that she herself was bound to it. Whether she accepted it or not, the house would claim her as its own unless she made the ultimate choice. The whispers in her mind grew louder, and suddenly, she could hear them outside her apartment too. She rushed to the window, staring into the darkened street below. The world outside felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too thick. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The night was pregnant with malevolent energy, and she felt it pressing in on her from all sides. Her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Without thinking, she answered. "Hello." Her voice was barely a whisper, fear making her throat dry. A low chuckle rumbled from the other end, sending a chill down her spine. "You've been running for far too long, Sophia. It's time to come home." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It was distorted, warped, but she recognized it. It was the voice from the house, the thing she had fought, the creature that had controlled the house. "I'm not coming back," Sophia said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're gone. The house is gone." The laugh grew louder, more mocking. "You're mistaken, my dear. The house is not gone. It is still here, and it will always find you. You can't escape what you are." Sophia slammed the phone down, her hands trembling. She glanced around the apartment, feeling the walls closing in on her. The air was thick with malevolent energy. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something was moving just outside her vision. The phone rang again. This time, she didn't pick up. She didn't have to. The voice, distant but unmistakable, whispered in her ear, "You will never escape me. The house will never let you go." Sophia couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to confront the house, had to understand it, even if it meant facing the terrifying truth. The whispers had been right. She had known the house was still there, deep down, but the truth was even worse than she had imagined. The house wasn't just a place of evil. It was a portal, a conduit for something far darker, something ancient that had fed on the souls of countless victims over the centuries. She left her apartment, her body trembling with anticipation and fear. There was no escape, no place left to run. She had no choice but to return to the house. Her footsteps were heavy, each one echoing in the empty street. She knew that what awaited her there would be more than she could bear, but she was already too deep in the web to turn back. The journey to the house felt surreal. It had only been a few days since she had last stood in front of it, but it felt like a lifetime. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the world had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette twisted and dark against the night sky. It looked abandoned, empty, no lights, no movement. But Sophia knew better than to trust appearances. As she stood before it, a wave of nausea washed over her. The house seemed to draw her in, its walls pulsating with a sinister energy. She could feel the weight of it, the years of suffering and despair that had been absorbed into its very foundation. It was as though the house itself had become a living, breathing entity, an embodiment of every soul it had consumed. Sophia reached for the door, her hand trembling. The moment her fingers brushed against the handle, the air seemed to thicken. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar interior. The walls were covered in shadows, the floors littered with debris. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. There was no sound, no movement. The house was waiting for her, patient and eternal. She stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers were louder now, but they weren't just in her head. They filled the room, seeping from the walls, from the very air around her. It was as if the house was speaking, its voice rising from every corner. "Welcome back, Sophia," the voice said, low and distorted. "You knew you would return. You cannot escape me." Sophia closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She had to face it, face the truth. The creature, the house, had fed on the souls of the living, but its true hunger had always been for one thing: to consume her. And now, the time had come for her to make her choice. As she took a step deeper into the house, the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. She could feel it. The house was drawing her in, feeding off her fear, her confusion. The walls seemed to, close in, pressing against her as she walked through the decaying corridors. The air was thick with dust and decay, but there was something else too, something old, something ancient. The house was a vessel for something far older than her or anyone else who had ever walked its halls. Sophia paused in the middle of the hallway, her mind racing. What if there was no way out? What if the house had already claimed her, and there was no hope of escape? She glanced at the walls, the faces that had been carved into the wood, the eyes that followed her every move. But then she remembered the key, the one thing she had used to stop the creature before. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to end it once and for all. The question was whether she had the strength to make the final sacrifice. Sophia's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she made her way deeper into the house. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. The house was awake now, and it was coming for her. She reached the center of the house, the place where the key had once been inserted into the heart of the darkness. The room was just as she remembered it, dimly lit, the walls covered in cracks, the air heavy with the scent of mold and decay. But there was something different now. The room seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, as though it were alive, responding to her presence. Sophia stepped forward, her heart pounding. She knew what had to be done. The key had worked before, but it had never truly severed the house's hold on her. The darkness had only been waiting, biding its time. And now, The time had come for her to either break the cycle or become a part of it forever. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the key. It felt cold in her hand, but as she held it, she could feel the power within it. The house wanted her. It had always wanted her. But she had a choice. She could either submit to it, let it consume her as it had done with so many others before, or she could end it once and for all. Sophia knew the price. It would take everything. She would have to give herself to the house, allowing it to feed on her soul, to end the darkness once and for all. But there was one final choice she had to make. Would she offer herself to save the world, or would she fight to live, knowing the house would never let her go? The darkness enveloped Sophia as she stood in the center of the room, the ancient key cold in her palm. The walls seemed to close in on her, as though the house itself were alive, breathing, waiting for her decision. The whispers in the air were louder now, more insistent. They clawed at her mind, their voices a mix of hunger, despair, and malice. "Join us, Sophia." The voice rasped from the shadows, familiar and alien all at once. "It's always been your fate. You know this. You cannot fight the inevitable." Her grip tightened around the key, her fingers trembling. It felt as if her very soul was being pulled into the depths of the house, drawn toward the heart of its malevolent power. But she refused to let go of the choice. She had come this far, and now, standing in the very heart of the nightmare, she had to make a decision that would either break the curse or bind her to the darkness forever. Sophia could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, her grandmother's pact, the torment of the lost souls, the countless sacrifices made in the name of power. The house had never been a mere building. It had been a vessel for something ancient, something far older than her, far older than humanity itself. It was a parasite, feeding on the living, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. Her grandmother had known this. She had made her choice long ago, willingly binding herself to the house's dark purpose in exchange for power. And now, Sophia stood at the precipice of that same choice, the same terrible fate. "I won't become a part of this," Sophia whispered to herself. Even as the house seemed to push back, the very air pressing against her chest, trying to force her into submission. But deep down, she knew. The house wasn't just after her, it was after her bloodline. She was the last of her grandmother's descendants, the final tether to the ancient pact. The house had been waiting for her, and now it was ready to claim her as its own. Sophia's eyes burned with determination. The key pulsed in her hand, vibrating with an unnatural energy. She had heard the voices of the house, felt their pull, but she was not like her grandmother. She wasn't willing to sacrifice herself, to feed the darkness for another moment. Her grandmother had been too afraid, too weak to break the cycle. But Sophia, she had a strength her grandmother had never known. She wasn't bound by the same fears, the same desires. She had seen the house for what it truly was, and she knew that the only way to end it was to destroy it, once and for all. The house shuddered. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if the very walls were alive, breathing, stretching to envelop her. She could feel the pull of the house deep within her bones. But she wasn't going to let it take her. Not today. Sophia stepped forward, holding the key tightly in her hand, and with a single, decisive motion, she thrust it into the heart of the room. There was a deafening crash of sound, the walls seeming to shake as though the house itself were screaming in agony. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and the house began to tremble. The whispers turned into wails of agony. The very foundation of the house groaned under the pressure, its walls beginning to splinter. The house was fighting back, but Sophia could feel its power waning. The darkness that had once suffocated her was beginning to retreat, pulling back into the depths from which it had come. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, imposing, its face obscured by a cloak of darkness. The creature, the true force behind the house. It wasn't the thing she had fought before. This was something far more ancient, something more terrifying. It stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, watching her, waiting. "You think you can destroy me?" The voice was deep, inhuman, as if the house itself spoke through the creature. "You cannot end what is eternal." Sophia felt a surge of fear, but she didn't back down. This was it, the final battle. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The house had used fear, desperation, and suffering to control her. But now, for the first time in her life, Sophia was free of that fear. She had come to understand the truth. The house wasn't invincible. It was nothing but a parasite, and parasites could be destroyed. "Watch me," she said, her voice steady strong. "You're not eternal. You're just a monster feeding on the fear of the living." With a deep breath, Sophia focused all her willpower into the key. The light from it grew brighter, casting harsh shadows across the room. The creature shrieked in fury, its form writhing, contorting as though it were being pulled apart. The house itself began to groan, its walls cracking, splitting open like a dying beast. Sophia pushed the key deeper into the very heart of the darkness. The house shuddered violently. A deafening roar filled the room, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Sophia could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet, the walls collapsing. Around her, the whispers turned into shrieks of rage as the house writhed, as though it were dying. She gritted her teeth and pushed harder, focusing all her strength into the key. The air around her seemed to grow hotter, thicker, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to collapse in on itself. And then, in an instant, everything went silent. Sophia opened her eyes, and she was standing in the center of an empty room. The walls were no longer moving, no longer alive. The air was still, heavy with an oppressive silence. The house was no more. The creature was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sophia was free. Her body ached from the effort, but she didn't care. She had won. The house was no more. She had broken the cycle. The darkness that had held her captive for so long had finally been destroyed. But as the silence stretched on, a strange sense of unease crept in. Had she really destroyed it? The thought lingered in the back of her mind, but she refused to give in to it. The house was gone. The creature was gone. For the first time in her life, she felt at peace. She took a deep breath, turned toward the door, and walked out into the light. Sophia stood on the steps of the house, the morning sun casting long shadows across the yard. The house, once dark and foreboding, was now nothing more than a crumbling ruin. It was over. The nightmare had ended. But as she looked back one last time, she felt a strange sensation, something tugging at her from deep within. A shadow, something distant but familiar, flickered at the edges of her mind. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced the thought away. It was over. With one final glance at the house, Sophia turned and walked away, the rising sun illuminating her path. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was free to face it. As the days passed, Sophia found herself in a kind of uneasy peace. The house, the creature, and the terrifying darkness that had haunted her for so long were gone. Yet something lingered in the corners of her mind, an unshakable feeling that the battle had not been entirely won. The air around her seemed lighter, but there was still a strange heaviness that she couldn't explain. She had returned to her apartment after the collapse of the house, hoping that time and distance would dull the sharp edges of the nightmare she had endured. And for a while it did. Life resumed a semblance of normalcy. She had even managed to start looking for a new job, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start anew. But the dreams came. At first, they were fleeting, almost imperceptible, a shadow in the corner of her vision, a whisper carried on the wind. But as the nights went on, they grew stronger, more vivid. She dreamed of the house again. She could see it from a distance, its silhouette against a sky bruised with purples and reds. The darkness swirled around it like smoke, and though she was far away, she could still hear the whispers. They called her name, familiar voices that clawed at her soul. In one dream, she stood before the house once more, the door creaking open as though inviting her in. She reached for the handle, but before she could touch it, a voice, clear and strong, echoed in her mind. The house isn't finished. Not yet. Sophia awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the room cold and silent. She stared at the ceiling, trying to catch her breath, the weight of the dream pressing down on her. She hadn't thought about the house in days, hadn't even dared to imagine it, yet it was there, haunting her from the depths of her mind. The following night, Sophia couldn't sleep. The remnants of the dream lingered like a fog, filling her thoughts until she could think of nothing else. The sense of finality she had once felt was gone. It was as if the house was still there, watching, waiting for her to return. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The house wasn't done with her. With a mix of fear and determination, Sophia knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep running from the past. It had followed her, even into her dreams. She needed answers. She needed to know what had really happened that night, and if there was anything left to destroy. She grabbed the journal her grandmother had left her, the journal that had once felt like a burden. But now, in the dim light of the night, it felt like the only connection she had to understanding what was happening. Flipping through the pages, she found herself drawn to the section where her grandmother had detailed the house's origins, its dark history, the rituals, the blood that had been spilled to summon its curse. The ancient binding spell had been broken, but Sophia hadn't truly destroyed the house. She had only severed its hold on her, and in doing so, left an open wound in its heart. Only when the last soul is taken will the house find peace. The words burned in her mind. The ritual, the warning, it was all connected, but she didn't understand it fully. The house wasn't just a place. It was a vessel for something ancient, a force of evil that fed off the souls of those who crossed its path. Sophia's fingers traced the lines of her grandmother's handwriting, and suddenly, she felt a chilling sense of clarity. The house wasn't finished because it hadn't taken the last soul. It needed one more, and that soul was hers. A knot of terror formed in her stomach. Her grandmother had sacrificed herself to bind the house, but she had never been free. The house had always known that it would need Sophia to complete the cycle. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The house had never been destroyed. Not really. It was still out there, still hungry, waiting for her to return and fulfill its dark purpose. Sophia felt the world spin around her. She couldn't breathe. The nightmare wasn't over. Sophia couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled into her chest. She had felt it for days now, the pull toward the house, as if the walls themselves were reaching for her. The journal had revealed everything she needed to know. The house was still alive, still hungry, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it needed. The realization gnawed at her like a constant itch beneath her skin. No matter how far she ran, how hard she tried to escape, the house would find her. And this time, there would be no way to destroy it. The only option was to confront it again. The evening sky had long since darkened by the time she stood before the ruins of the house. The place where she had once destroyed its heart now stood like a broken shell. Its bones were still there, the foundation cracked, but the air around it was different. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for her to return. Sophia's footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as she approached. The wind carried with it the faintest whisper of a voice, her name, soft but insistent. Sophia. She reached out for the door, her heart pounding, but when her hand made contact with the cold wood, the door creaked open on its own. It wasn't the same house she had left. This one was darker, more alive, its walls pulsing with a strange energy. The air inside was thick with tension, as though the house itself was waiting for her to make her next move. The floor beneath her feet groaned as she stepped inside, and she felt a chill in her bones. The smell of decay and dust filled the air, But there was something more, something new. It wasn't just the house that had changed. The darkness inside had grown stronger. The creature was still there, watching from the shadows. Sophia could feel its eyes on her, could hear its breath echoing through the halls, waiting, biding its time. "You've come back," the creature's voice rang out, deep and mocking. "You know the truth now. You understand. It's always been you. The last soul." Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. She had been right. She wasn't just connected to the house. She was its final piece. The house had never been destroyed. It had only been dormant, waiting for her to return and fulfill the last part of the curse. But this time, Sophia wasn't going to run. She couldn't. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. The house might still be alive, but she wouldn't let it take her. Not now. Not ever. She reached for the journal again, flipping to the last page. It was there, hidden in the margins, a final, unfinished incantation. Something her grandmother had never completed. A way to seal the house once and for all. Sophia began to speak the words aloud, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each syllable. The air grew thick with a cold, unnatural chill as Sophia recited the incantation, her voice echoing through the empty halls of the house. The walls trembled, groaning as if the house itself were protesting, but Sophia didn't stop. She couldn't. This was her only chance to break the curse once and for all. The creature in the shadows hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You think you can stop me? You think a few words will change anything? I am eternal. I am the darkness that has always existed." But Sophia didn't flinch. She pushed forward, her words gaining strength as she invoked the final binding spell. The house shuddered violently, its walls cracking, the ground beneath her feet shaking as though the very foundation of the world was being torn apart. And then, with a final, deafening scream, the house began to collapse. The walls caved in. The darkness screamed in agony, and the creature howled, its form twisting and contorting as it was pulled back into the depths from which it had come. Sophia stood there, the journal still in her hands, watching as the house disintegrated into nothingness. The last of the whispers faded away, leaving only silence in its wake. For the first time, there was peace. The dust settled slowly. The collapse of the house left behind nothing but rubble and silence. Sophia stood in the center of the ruins, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected the destruction to be so complete, so final. The air felt clearer now, lighter, as though the weight that had hung over her for so long had finally been lifted. The oppressive feeling of the house, of the darkness, was gone. For a moment, all she could do was breathe. Her body ached from the tension, the fear, the exhaustion. The ritual had taken everything out of her, but it was worth it. The house was gone. The creature that had haunted her and her family for generations was no more. And yet, as she stood there, the calm after the storm felt almost too quiet. Sophia looked down at the journal in her hands. Her grandmother's handwriting was faint now, as though the ink had faded over the years, but the words were clear. She had done it. She had finished what her grandmother started. The house had been destroyed. The curse was broken. And yet, there was still a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a feeling she couldn't shake. She scanned the wreckage once more, her gaze falling on something she hadn't noticed before. Amid the debris, something glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Curiosity tugged at her, and she walked over, her feet crunching on the broken stone and wood. She knelt down and reached for the object, carefully brushing away the dust and rubble. It was a small, silver locket. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found a photo, her grandmother's face staring back at her, young and full of life, just as she had remembered her. But something about the photo was off. There was a shadow in the background, a shape that didn't belong, a presence that seemed almost too dark for the picture. A chill ran down Sophia's spine. She closed the locket quickly and stood, her mind racing. The house had been destroyed. But the darkness, had it truly been eradicated? The quiet that followed the destruction of the house stretched on for days. Sophia returned to her apartment, seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings. But peace had never felt so elusive. Despite everything she had done, despite the relief that came with the house's collapse, there was something unsettled within her. The locket was always on her mind. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away, though she knew it should have been burned or buried. Something about it seemed important, almost like it was trying to tell her something. The dreams continued. They were different now, more fragmented. She saw her grandmother, but her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. The house was there too, looming in the background, its walls stretching upward, impossibly tall, as though it was coming alive once again. The darkness still lingered, swirling like smoke, seeping through the cracks in the walls, reaching for her. Every time she woke up, she was drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The sense of dread she had once felt around the house returned, and it was only growing stronger. One night, Sophia couldn't stand it anymore. She had to go back. She had to know if the house was truly gone. Sophia returned to the ruins of the house the following morning. It had been days since its collapse, and the remains were already beginning to blend into the earth. Grass and weeds had started to creep through the cracks in the stone, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim the land. She wandered through the wreckage, searching for anything that might offer a clue as to what was happening. The house had been destroyed, so why did it feel like something was watching her? Why did she feel like she wasn't alone? As she walked deeper into the remains, something caught her eye. A dark, smooth stone, unlike the rest of the crumbling rubble. She knelt down to inspect it, brushing off the dust, revealing a symbol etched into its surface. The markings were strange, an unfamiliar language, perhaps, or an ancient script. Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the symbol from the journal. It was the same one that had appeared in her grandmother's notes, the same one that had marked the beginning of the curse. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The stone felt cold to the touch, and as her fingers brushed over the symbol, she felt something shift in the air. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor, but the ground beneath her feet began to hum with an eerie energy. The house had not been destroyed after all. It had only been sealed away. A voice whispered in the wind, soft but unmistakable. "You cannot escape us. You belong to us." Sophia's pulse quickened. She stood up, her legs weak beneath her, and turned toward the remnants of the house. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around her, carrying with it the faint whispers of the house's past. She couldn't tell if the voices were coming from inside her mind or if they were real. But she knew one thing. The house had never truly died. The curse wasn't finished. It had only been waiting. Sophia's return to the ruins only deepened the mystery. The stone she had found, the strange symbol, it all pointed to something much larger than she had initially understood. The house wasn't just a haunted place. It was a living entity, an anchor for a malevolent force that had been tied to her family for generations. She knew she couldn't leave it behind. Not now. The darkness had followed her once more, and now it seemed to be calling her back to finish what had been started. But what if this was a trap? What if by returning, she had only sealed her fate? The more Sophia thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a fight for her life. It was a fight for the very soul of her family, for everyone who had been touched by the curse. She needed to learn the true nature of the house. She needed to know what its heart was, where its true power lay, and how she could finally destroy it for good. The locket, her grandmother's locket, had to hold the key. She would find out what it meant, what it was trying to tell her. With renewed resolve, Sophia turned back toward the ruin of the house, feeling the weight of the past closing in around her. The darkness hadn't finished with her yet, and she had no choice but to face it once again. This time, however, she would be ready. The days grew longer, and with each passing one, Sophia's sense of urgency grew. She pored over her grandmother's journal, examining every passage for new details. She went back to the ruins, searching for more signs, more clues that would explain the true power of the house. It was then that she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The house, it seemed, was not just a vessel for the creature, for the darkness. It was a portal, a gateway, and the locket, her grandmother's locket, had been the key all along. It wasn't just a trinket, it was a symbol of her grandmother's pact with the house. The locket had bound her grandmother to the house, and in turn, it had bound Sophia to the same fate. But there was one more detail that made her pause. If she was to destroy the house once and for all, she would have to destroy the locket. It wasn't just a key, it was the heart of the curse. To destroy the house, she had to sever the final link between her family and the evil that had been growing for so long. Sophia's hands shook as she looked at the locket. This was the moment of truth. This was the final act. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the locket. Sophia returned to the ruins one final time. The air felt charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. She stood at the center of the collapsed foundation, the wind whipping through the broken walls. The sky overhead a deep, bruised purple. The world felt on the edge of something, as if everything were about to tip into the unknown. With one final, deliberate motion, she opened the locket. Inside, the picture of her grandmother stared back at her, but this time, it was different. The shadow in the background was clearer now, and it was no longer just a dark shape. It was a face, twisted and angry, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Sophia's pulse quickened. She knew what she had to do. She threw the locket to the ground, smashing it into the earth with everything she had. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening. But then, the ground began to rumble, and a deep, guttural sound filled the air. The earth cracked open, and from the depths of the ruins, the creature emerged, more powerful than ever, its eyes glowing with ancient fury. But this time, Sophia was ready. The cycle was about to end. The creature emerged from the ruins with a force that shook the very ground beneath Sophia's feet. Its form was grotesque, a mass of shadows and shifting darkness, its eyes gleaming with pure malice. As it towered before her, the air around her seemed to grow colder, thicker, almost suffocating. The smell of decay and rot wafted from it, as if the very essence of death clung to its being. Sophia's heart raced, but she stood firm, refusing to back down. This was it, the end. The house, the curse, the creature, it all had to end here. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its voice reverberating through the ground. You think you can stop me, little girl? You think breaking the locket will destroy me? Its voice was guttural, mocking, as if it had seen countless others fall to its power. Sophia didn't flinch. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the journal. The pages were worn, tattered from years of handling, but the knowledge within them still burned brightly. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Curse will end when the heart of the house is destroyed. The locket had been the heart, but it wasn't just the object. It was the bond, the final tether that kept the creature bound to this world. Destroying the locket had been the first step, but there was more to be done. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the ritual her grandmother had written about. She had to tap into the strength that had been passed down to her blood, her lineage, the very will to survive. It's not over yet, she whispered to herself. She could feel the energy within her stirring, building like a storm. The creature snarled, its form twisting, growing more monstrous as it sensed the power rising within her. You think your bloodline can save you? It hissed, advancing toward her with terrifying speed. Sophia opened her eyes, meeting its gaze. She wasn't afraid. She was done running. The darkness had claimed enough of her family, enough of her life. With a sudden motion, she raised her hand, clutching the journal tightly. The words on the pages began to glow, a faint light illuminating the text. It was the last of the binding spell, the final incantation that would sever the creature from the world for good. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the power surged through her body tingling with the intensity of the magic she was invoking. She could feel the energy building, wrapping around her like a suffocating embrace, but she didn't let go. She knew this was the only way. The creature roared in fury, lunging at her with fangs bared. It was too late. "You are finished," Sophia said, her voice strong and unwavering. And with those words, she spoke the final incantation. A blinding light erupted from the journal, engulfing everything in its path. The creature screeched, its form writhing in agony as the light consumed it. The ground cracked open beneath it, and the very air seemed to pulse with the energy of the spell. The earth groaned, as though it was being torn apart by the power that Sophia had unleashed. The creature struggled, thrashing against the light, but it was no use. Its body began to disintegrate, turning into a cloud of black smoke, dissipating into the air. The screeches grew fainter, fading into nothingness, until the last remnants of the creature were completely erased from existence. And then silence. The light began to fade, leaving Sophia standing in the center of the ruins, breathless and trembling. The ground was still cracked, but there was no longer any sign of the creature. The dark presence that had haunted her for so long had been erased, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her was gone. Sophia felt the weight of the journal in her hands, the final spell now complete. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind once more, a whisper of reassurance. "It's over. The curse is broken. You have freed us all." But Sophia knew there was one last thing to do. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she placed the journal on the ground. She had done what she needed to do, but she had to ensure that the darkness would never return. The ruins of the house lay before her, a monument to the horrors that had been. She pulled the journal close and spoke one last prayer, one final incantation. The words were soft, yet powerful, words that would seal away the remnants of the house forever. The wind shifted as Sophia stood once again in the center of the ruins. The ritual was complete. The house was no more. The darkness had been driven back into the depths, where it could never touch her or her family again. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the air was calm. The sun, which had been hidden behind dark clouds for as long as Sophia could remember, began to break through, casting warm light over the land. The earth seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as though it too had been freed from the weight of the curse. Sophia felt the burden lift from her shoulders. She knew that it was over, that she had done what no one else had been able to do. She had freed herself from the house. She had freed her family, and she had ensured that no one else would ever fall prey to the same fate. As she stood there, watching the sun rise over the horizon, she knew that she was free. The house, the creature, the curse, they were gone, and she could finally live her life. But as the sunlight bathed her in warmth, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering just out of sight. A shadow in the corner of her vision, the faintest whisper on the wind. She shook her head. It was nothing, just the remnants of fear, the echoes of the past. With a final, deep breath, she turned and walked away from the ruins. The darkness was gone, and with it, the nightmare. Years later, Sophia would look back on that day and realize just how much it had changed her. The house, the creature, the curse, they had all been part of a dark chapter in her life, one that she had finally closed. But the legacy of her family, the strength she had inherited, was something that would remain with her forever. She moved on, started a family of her own, and lived a life free of fear. Yet, sometimes on the quietest of nights, she would catch herself glancing over her shoulder, wondering if the darkness would ever return. But she would always remember what her grandmother had taught her, that strength, no matter how much darkness it faced, could endure. And in the end, the light always won. Years passed, and Sophia's life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The horrors of the past became distant memories, fading like whispers in the wind. She married, had children, and lived a life free from the fear that had once consumed her. The world outside seemed peaceful, and her family flourished, untouched by the darkness that had nearly torn them apart. But despite everything, there was a lingering sense of unease that refused to leave her. It began subtly at first. A strange sensation when she walked into an empty room, a faint shiver running down her spine for no reason at all. The echoes of the past, perhaps. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision, or hear a whisper carried on the wind that she couldn't quite make out. Sophia tried to push it aside, convincing herself that it was nothing, just the remnants of trauma, the lingering effects of the curse that had once held her in its grip. But no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, the unease grew stronger. And then one night it happened. Sophia was sitting alone in her living room, reading a book. The soft light of the fireplace flickered in the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She had just turned a page when she heard it. A creak. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the house settling, as old houses tended to do. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced toward the hallway, where the sound had come from. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. She stood up and walked toward the hallway, trying to calm her racing thoughts. It was just the house, she told herself. It had to be. But as she reached the door to the room where the sound had come from, she froze. The door was slightly ajar. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had been the last one to go to bed. No one had been in the house but her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open just a crack. The room inside was empty, but the air felt wrong, cold. She stepped inside, her senses alert, scanning every corner, every shadow. The room was the same as it always had been, yet something was off. A faint odor of decay lingered, something she hadn't noticed before. Her eyes moved toward the window. It was open, just a sliver, allowing the cool night air to rush inside. But it was more than that. There was something else, a shape dark and blurry, just beyond the glass. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to look, but her body moved on its own, slowly turning her gaze toward the figure. A silhouette, a shadow, the outline of a figure standing just outside in the darkness. For a moment, Sophia stood frozen. Her mind raced, but the terror that gripped her made it impossible to think clearly. Was it the creature? Impossible. It had been destroyed. She had seen it disappear. But as she stood there, a whisper reached her ears. "You can't escape us?" Her knees nearly buckled as the voice sent a wave of dread crashing over her. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. The shadow outside didn't move, but it was there watching. The next few days were a blur. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every corner of the house seemed to hide something. Every sound, no matter how mundane, made her jump. It wasn't just the house, it was her mind. The nightmares had returned with a vengeance, and now they followed her even in the waking hours. One night, as she stood alone in her kitchen, the shadows once again seemed to grow. She could feel them, creeping toward her, pressing against her skin, suffocating her. Her heart raced as she turned quickly, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. Yet she knew, deep in her bones, that something was there. Watching, waiting. The whispers, the flickering shadows, they were growing stronger, more insistent. The house had been destroyed. The creature had been banished, or so she thought. But this was different. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't understand it. But she knew that whatever had once been trapped in the house was not finished with her. Not by a long shot. Sophia couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to return. There was no other choice. The house, the creature, the curse, whatever it was calling her back, pulling her toward the ruins. Her family, oblivious to her growing fears, noticed nothing unusual. They were living their lives just as they always had. But for Sophia, the sense of dread had become unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't as closed as she had believed. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a living force, something ancient and powerful, and it had found a way to reach her. She packed a small bag, wrote a note to her family, and left in the middle of the night. She drove through the winding roads, the silence of the empty streets pressing down on her. The ruins of the house loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. Sophia arrived at the site, her heart pounding in her chest. The place that had once been the site of so much pain, so much suffering, was eerily still. The ground was overgrown with weeds and brush, the stone foundations long since reclaimed by nature. But as Sophia stood at the edge of the wreckage, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a presence. She wasn't alone. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, and a faint murmur echoed from the depths of the earth, as if the house itself were alive. The air grew colder, heavier, and the shadows around her lengthened. Sophia stepped forward, drawn to the center of the ruins. It was as though something inside the earth was pulling her, beckoning her closer. And then she saw it, a figure emerging from the wreckage, shrouded in darkness. It was not the creature she had faced before. This was something different, something worse. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with the weight of its presence. Sophia didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. The nightmare was far from over. Sophia's pulse raced as she stood face to face with the dark figure. It was towering, made of shadows and swirling darkness, its form indistinct yet undeniably alive. There was no question now, the curse had never truly been broken. The darkness had only been sealed away, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The ground beneath her feet shuddered as the figure moved closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, the same malevolent glow she had seen in her nightmares. "You thought you could escape," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. "But you were wrong." Sophia's mind raced. She had to act and fast. The ritual she had completed all those years ago, had it been incomplete? Or had something changed? Had her family's bloodline, her very existence, somehow bound her to this malevolent force? The answer was clear now. The creature was not simply a physical entity. It was a part of her her family's legacy. And only by severing that final connection would she be free. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as the dark figure loomed before her, its malevolent eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. The air around her seemed to pulse with the creature's power, thick and suffocating, as if every breath she took was being stolen from her. The realization hit her like a wave. The curse was not just tied to the house, nor was it confined to the creature she had defeated years ago. It had always been tied to her bloodline, woven into the very fabric of her existence. The creature, or whatever it was, had never been fully banished. It had only been temporarily sealed, waiting for the right moment to return. "You are part of me." The creature's voice reverberated in her mind, its words sinking deep into her consciousness. "And now, you will give me what I desire." Sophia's knees shook, but she stood her ground. There was no more running, no more hiding. This was the moment that would determine everything. The creature advanced toward her, its body shifting and distorting as it moved, its form growing taller, more monstrous. It was a nightmare made flesh, an embodiment of all the darkness that had plagued her family for generations. But Sophia knew what she had to do. Her grandmother's teachings, the words of the ritual, the locket, they had all led her to this moment. The binding had been incomplete, but now she could finish it. She could end this once and for all. Taking a deep breath, Sophia stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached into her bag. She pulled out the journal, the very one that had guided her through the first ritual. The pages, though weathered and worn, still carried the knowledge she needed. She opened it to the last page, the incantation that had always felt incomplete, unfinished. yet somehow familiar. She whispered the words under her breath, the ancient syllables echoing in the air, and as she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me with words?" Sneered, its voice like 1,000 whispers in the dark. "You are nothing." But Sophia pressed on, speaking louder now, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. "I am not afraid of you." The pages radiating outward. The air grew thick with power, and for a brief moment, Sophia could feel her blood, her family's blood, awakening, responding to the ancient magic that ran through her veins. The shadows that had been pressing in around her recoiled, as though the light from the journal was burning them away. The creature screeched, its form flickering and distorting, as if the very foundation of its being was being unraveled. "No!" it howled, its voice a jagged, furious cry. "You cannot break this bond. We are one. You cannot escape me." But Sophia's resolve was unshakable. This was it, the final ritual. The heart of the house, the heart of the curse, was within her reach. The creature was tied to her, but now she could sever that bond, destroy it once and for all. She raised the journal high, the light blazing brighter than ever before, and she spoke the final words of the incantation. "By blood and by flame, I cast you out. I sever the bond, and I end this curse." With the final word, the light exploded outward in a burst of energy, blinding and pure. The creature screamed, its form disintegrating into nothingness, as though it could not withstand the power of the spell. It writhed and shrieked, but it was no use. The curse was finally broken. The light began to fade, and with it, the creature's presence. The ground settled, and Sophia collapsed to her knees, the journal falling from her hands as she gasped for breath. Her body was trembling, exhausted from the battle that had nearly consumed her. But the relief that washed over her was overwhelming. It was done. The curse was finally broken. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting their warm light over the ruins. The house, the creature, the terror, they were all gone. For the first time in years, Sophia felt a sense of peace she had longed for. She had freed herself and her family from the darkness that had haunted them for generations. As she stood up, wiping the dirt from her knees, she glanced around the ruins one last time. It was over. There was nothing left here but the remnants of a past that could no longer hurt her. She had faced her fears, confronted the evil that had taken so much from her, and now she was free. But Sophia knew that she could never forget. The house had been a part of her life, and even though it was gone, the memories would linger. The lessons, the pain, the strength, it had all shaped her into the person she had become. As she turned to leave the ruins, a sense of closure settled over her. The curse was broken. The creature was gone, and she had survived. She made her way back to her car, the weight in her chest lighter than it had ever been. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was free. Sophia drove back home, the rising sun in her rearview mirror, and as the road stretched before her, she knew that this chapter of her life had ended. She could finally begin to live again. Years passed, and Sophia's life flourished in ways she had never imagined. She married, had children, and built a life that was everything the dark legacy of her family had never been. The darkness that had once seemed all-consuming had been vanquished, leaving behind a legacy of strength and resilience. Her children grew up in a world free of the horrors she had known, and as they got older, Sophia began to tell them the stories of the past. Not of the terror and the fear, but of the courage and the determination it took to break the curse. She wanted them to know that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always light on the other side. One day, as she sat in her garden, watching her children play, Sophia felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that her family was safe, and that the house, the creature, and the curse were nothing but distant memories. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. And as the sun set on another peaceful evening, Sophia looked toward the horizon and smiled. The darkness had been defeated, and in its place, she had found the light. Despite the peace Sophia had found, there remained a subtle disquiet in the back of her mind, a sense that something was not entirely finished. Though the curse had been broken and the creature vanquished, a part of her wondered if the darkness might someday return. Years had passed, and the nightmares had become rare, fleeting things. But every now and then, as she lay in bed, the air would grow colder, and she would hear the faintest whisper, like a forgotten memory tugging at her subconscious. She would dismiss it as just that, memories of a time best left behind, but in the deepest parts of her heart, she couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. One rainy evening, after tucking her children into bed, Sophia sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal that had once been her guide. She hadn't opened it in years, but tonight, something compelled her to turn its pages once more. As she did, her eyes fell on a passage she had never noticed before. A page tucked in between the worn edges of the leather binding. A part of the ritual she had never completed. The words seemed familiar, yet foreign. Her heart began to race as she read aloud the cryptic lines. The end is not the end, for the thread still remains. To sever all ties, one must face the mirror, where the darkness breathes within. Sophia froze, the words echoing in her mind. She had completed the ritual. She had severed the bond between herself and the creature. Or so she had believed. But this was something different. The final line, the mention of a mirror, felt like a key that had been hidden in plain sight. Her fingers trembled as she closed the journal, her mind swirling with a storm of thoughts. Could there be more to the curse? Was there another layer, something she had missed? The idea gnawed at her. She couldn't ignore it. Sophia had learned long ago not to ignore her instincts, especially when it came to matters of the unknown. So, as much as she hated to admit it, she had to face the possibility that her journey was far from over. She began searching her home for mirrors, any surface that might harbor something darker. There was one mirror in particular, a large antique frame that had been a family heirloom. It had been passed down through generations, always hung in the same hallway of her childhood home. It was the one piece of furniture from the old house that she had insisted on keeping. The mirror had always made her feel uneasy, but she had chalked it up to her own fears. Yet now, standing before it, Sophia realized she had never truly examined it. The frame, intricately carved with symbols she could not decipher, seemed to pulse with an energy she had never noticed before. Her reflection in the glass seemed off. It wasn't that the image was distorted, but something about it felt wrong. Her eyes locked with her reflection, and for a fleeting moment, she could have sworn the figure in the mirror was smiling, a dark, knowing smile. Her breath caught in her throat, but she refused to look away. The words from the journal echoed in her mind. The darkness breathes within. Sophia slowly stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached toward the mirror. As her fingertips brushed the surface of the mirror, a sharp, cold sensation surged through her body, as though the glass were alive. A rush of images flooded her mind, flickers of memories she hadn't consciously recalled for years. The house, the creature, the rituals, and then something new, a vision of herself, but not the Sophia she knew. The reflection in the mirror twisted and distorted, revealing a darker version of herself. Her eyes, once full of warmth, were now cold, filled with an ancient malice. The reflection reached out, its fingers curling toward the edge of the glass, as if it were calling her. Sophia recoiled, but the mirror seemed to pull her closer, a force too strong to resist. She felt herself drawn toward it, like a moth to a flame. The surface of the glass rippled, and suddenly, she was no longer standing in front of the mirror. She was inside it. The world around her shifted, and Sophia found herself standing in a dimly lit room, its walls lined with mirrors, each one reflecting her own image. Some were cracked, others tarnished, but they all contained the same unnerving darkness. There was no escape. "Welcome home," a voice whispered from the shadows. It was a voice she knew well. Her own. The reflection stepped forward, its face a twisted mockery of her own. "You thought you could destroy the darkness. You thought you could escape it, but it was always within you." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind reeling with confusion and fear. The reflection was her, but it was also something else, something ancient, something that had always been there, hiding just beneath the surface of her soul. The curse was never just about the house, Sophia. The reflection continued, its voice growing colder, more venomous. It was about you. You were the key, the vessel. The darkness can never be destroyed, only contained. In you. You are the one who must carry it. Sophia shook her head, fighting to push back the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "No, I broke the curse. I freed myself." The reflection smiled, the grin stretching too wide, too unnatural. "Did you? Or did you merely release it into a new form? The thread that binds us is unbroken. You are mine, and I am yours. We will never be apart." A chill ran down Sophia's spine as the reflection reached toward her, its fingers brushing against her skin. The coldness seeped through her, deeper than any physical chill. It was as though the very darkness had infiltrated her soul, twisting and suffocating her from within. She realized the truth. She had never truly been free. The curse was not some external force. It was a part of her, a darkness that had always existed in her bloodline, a part of her that had never been purged. She had carried it with her, hidden away, and now it had surfaced once again. Sophia's vision blurred, and she staggered back, her mind spinning. She wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the oppressive grip of the darkness that had taken hold of her. But there was nowhere to go. The reflection in the mirror smiled cruelly, its eyes gleaming with malevolent satisfaction. "You can never outrun your past, Sophia. You can never escape what you are." The room around her seemed to shift and change, the mirrors warping and bending. Each reflection became more distorted, more twisted, as if the darkness was taking on a life of its own. And then, it all collapsed into one final image, the image of Sophia herself, broken and consumed by the very darkness she had tried so hard to escape. But there was one thing Sophia had not realized. The mirror was not just a reflection. It was a prison, a trap, and in that moment, she understood. The darkness she had fought so hard to banish had always been a part of her. And now, it had found a new vessel, a new home. Sophia stood before the mirror, her heart racing as the full weight of her realization sank in. The reflection, her reflection, had never truly been separate from her. It was an extension of the darkness that had always existed within her soul, waiting to be acknowledged. The creature had not been defeated, not entirely. It had simply taken a different form, one that had blended into the very fabric of her being. The room around her seemed to pulse with an eerie, suffocating energy, the mirrors twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. They reflected countless versions of her, some smiling, others crying, but all of them bearing the same hollow, dark emptiness. Her eyes, wide with horror, flicked from one mirror to the next, desperately searching for a way out. But the more she searched, the deeper she felt herself being controlled. "You will never be free," the reflection whispered, its voice now a low, seductive hiss. "You belong to the darkness. It is your true nature, your fate." Sophia took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt as though the walls were closing in around her, her body trembling with the weight of the revelation. The creature, the darkness, was not just something she had fought against. It was part of her. Her blood, her soul, were forever intertwined with it. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't accept this." The reflection grinned wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You have no choice. You never did." But as the words echoed through the room, something shifted. A flicker of resistance, a spark of defiance, ignited within her. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The light within her, the part of herself that had always fought back, began to glow, pushing against the darkness. "No," she said, this time louder, more certain. "I will not let you control me. I will break free. I will destroy you." The reflection's smile faltered, but it quickly regained its malevolent composure. "You think you can destroy me?" It sneered. "I am you, and you are me. We are one." The mirrors shattered, their fragments falling to the ground like raindrops of glass. Each shard reflected a different version of Sophia, some twisted, some broken, some pure, but all of them connected by the thread of darkness that ran through her veins. The sound of the glass breaking seemed to reverberate in her skull, each shard an echo of the struggle she had fought, of the battle she still had to face. Sophia closed her eyes, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, despair, hope. But amidst it all, she found a single thought that cut through the chaos. "I am not you." And with that realization, she did something she had never done before. She let go. Sophia let the darkness rise, not to control it, but to understand it. She didn't fight it. She didn't push it away. She embraced it, allowing it to wash over her like a tidal wave. The fear that had once gripped her, fear of the curse, fear of the creature, fear of herself, began to dissipate. The reflection in the shattered glass no longer seemed as terrifying, nor did the voice in her mind seem as all-consuming. The mirrors were broken, their power shattered, and with it, the hold the creature had over her was weakening. She was no longer running from herself. She wasn't trying to sever the darkness from her being. She wasn't rejecting her past. Instead, she accepted it, the good and the bad, the light and the dark. For the first time in her life, Sophia understood that she was not just a vessel for the darkness. She was its master. The air in the room shifted. The oppressive weight that had clung to her for so long began to dissipate. The shadows retreated, no longer able to latch onto her with the same force. She had done what was necessary. She had reconciled with the darkness, not as an enemy, but as a part of her. Sophia felt something inside her break, but this time, it wasn't a breaking of her spirit. It was a breaking of the chains that had bound her to the curse, to the fear, to the endless cycle of violence and torment. She was free. When Sophia opened her eyes again, the room had changed. The mirrors were gone, the shadows lifted, and the oppressive air had been replaced by a soft, warm glow. The world outside the room was quiet, peaceful. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the stillness, allowing herself to fully absorb the weight of what had just happened. She had conquered the darkness, not by eradicating it, but by accepting it. She had learned that true power didn't come from rejecting one's nature. It came from understanding and embracing it. Sophia left the room, the broken mirrors still scattered on the floor. She stepped into the hallway, where the faintest glimmer of sunlight filtered in through the windows. The world outside was bright and new, waiting for her to step back into it. Her children, her family, they would never know the full extent of her journey. They didn't need to. The curse was broken. The creature was gone. And now, all that remained was the life she had fought for, the life she would now live fully, without fear. As Sophia walked toward the door, a soft breeze swept through the house, carrying with it a sense of calm. The past was behind her. The darkness was no longer something to be feared. It was simply a part of the human condition. A shadow that could not be ignored, but also could not define her. She opened the door and stepped outside into the light, her heart unburdened for the first time in years. Sophia was free. After her victory in the mirror, a lingering question haunted Sophia's thoughts. What does it mean to embrace the darkness within you? For years, she had seen the curse as an external force, something that needed to be defeated, expelled, erased from her life. But now, standing in the light of her new understanding, she realized that the darkness wasn't just an external evil, it was a part of her, interwoven with her very essence. The fear that had once fueled her desperation was now shifting into curiosity. What if this darkness, this part of her that had always been there, wasn't something inherently evil? What if it was something that could be harnessed? Sophia couldn't deny that part of her had always been afraid of the darkness, afraid of what she might become. The cursed house, the creature, it all made sense now. It was never about defeating the darkness, but understanding it and, in turn, herself. She began reflecting on her family's history, the long line of ancestors who had been cursed with this same shadow. They had always lived in fear of it, trying to keep it buried deep within. Her grandmother, who had taught her about the rituals, had made it clear that the darkness was something to be avoided at all costs. But Sophia was beginning to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong. What if their refusal to confront the darkness directly had kept it alive? By pushing it away, had they inadvertently fed it, allowing it to grow stronger and more dangerous? As she spent time in solitude, walking through the woods near her home, Sophia began to see the darkness in a new light. The forest around her had once seemed like a place of solitude and danger, a reflection of the shadows she had battled all her life. But now, with the clarity she had gained, she noticed something different. The shadows were not simply there to scare her. They existed as part of the cycle of life. Without darkness, there could be no light, no growth. She recalled her grandmother's words. To know the light, you must first know the darkness. It wasn't a simple lesson, not a platitude. It was a profound truth that Sophia was beginning to understand fully. Light and dark weren't opposing forces. They were intertwined, interdependent. If she could learn to embrace the darkness within herself, perhaps she could wield it, not as an enemy, but as a tool to build a life that was more authentic, more whole. Sophia spent the following months reflecting on this new understanding, trying to integrate the darkness into her life. This wasn't a simple matter of pushing away the nightmares or denying the parts of her that felt violent, fearful, or angry. It was about sitting with those emotions, letting them speak, acknowledging their existence, and learning to use them for good. There were moments when the darkness would surface, like shadows creeping at the edges of her thoughts. In those moments, she could feel the old fear rising, the fear of becoming what she had once hated. But she learned to meet those feelings with compassion, to remind herself that these emotions didn't have to control her. In the silence of the night, she meditated on this newfound understanding. The darkness inside her was not just a collection of negative emotions or a manifestation of evil. It was a reflection of her deepest, rawest self. Her anger, her fear, her hurt, they were all parts of her that had been repressed for years. They were the pieces of her soul that had been buried beneath the weight of the curse. But now, she could bring them to the surface. Sophia began practicing techniques to center herself, breathing exercises, journaling, shadow work. It wasn't an easy process. The darkness would still come to haunt her. But with each passing day, it became a little easier to confront it, a little easier to hear its voice without feeling overwhelmed by it. She realized that the creature, the force that had once seemed so monstrous, was merely a symbol of her own repressed power. The house, the curse, it was all part of a larger pattern of fear and control that had governed her family for generations. "You were never weak," she whispered to herself one night as she sat by the window, watching the rain fall. "You were just afraid." And now, she was no longer afraid. The darkness was not something she had to banish. It wasn't an external entity that needed to be destroyed. It was a part of her, and she needed to perform a different ritual, one not about exorcising the shadows, but about accepting them. The realization came slowly, but it was clear. The rituals her grandmother had taught her were based on fear, on severing ties, casting out evil, denying the darker aspects of the self. But Sophia understood now that true healing came from integration, not separation. The journal, which had once been a tool for ritualistic destruction, now became her guide to something different. She began modifying the ritual, rewriting the incantations. Instead of banishing the darkness, she invoked it, inviting it into her body and soul, asking it to coexist with the light. She wasn't just freeing herself from the past. She was reclaiming her past, accepting her own shadow as a valid part of her being. The ritual, as it unfolded, was not one of destruction, but one of transformation. She stood in the center of the room, the journal open before her, and spoke the words she had written herself. I am both the light and the dark. I accept all parts of myself. I embrace what I have feared, and in doing so, I free myself from its chains. As she spoke those words, the room seemed to shift around her. The air grew thick with energy, not oppressive, but filled with the presence of something ancient, something wise. It was the energy of balance, the equilibrium between light and dark. The ritual ended not with a burst of power or a flash of light, but with a quiet stillness. Sophia felt a deep peace settle over her. It wasn't a perfect peace, not an absence of fear or struggle, but it was a peace that came from knowing that she no longer had to fight herself. She could coexist with the darkness within her. She could live with it, and in doing so, she could transform it into something beautiful. As the years passed, Sophia's life continued to evolve. The darkness never completely disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. It became a force she could wield. Her anger, her pain, her shadow, no longer something to fear, but something that fueled her purpose. She used her understanding of the darkness to help others. She became a guide to those who struggled with their own inner shadows, teaching them the importance of integration rather than suppression. Sophia built a legacy, not one of breaking curses, but one of healing. She passed on the lessons she had learned, showing others that true freedom comes not from defeating the darkness, but from embracing it with grace. Her family, the generations before her, had tried to fight the darkness, but they had never understood its true nature. Now, with Sophia's wisdom, the curse was no longer a curse at all. It was simply a part of the human experience. And in that acceptance, Sophia found not just peace, but purpose. Sophia had always been a quiet presence in the world, but after her acceptance of the darkness within her, she became something else entirely. No longer was she the woman haunted by fears she didn't understand. Instead, she was a quiet force of wisdom, grounded in a deep self-awareness that radiated from her like an invisible aura. Her family had sensed a shift. They saw the calmness in her eyes, the new way she carried herself, like someone who no longer flinched at every shadow, every unexpected sound. But what Sophia hadn't anticipated was how this new self would be tested. It started with an unexpected visit. A distant relative, someone she'd barely heard of, arrived at her doorstep one evening, eyes wide with panic. A young woman, late 20s, her face pale as though she hadn't slept in days, clutching a bundle of old, familiar papers, rituals, incantations, the things Sophia had once relied on to cast out the curse. "Help me," the woman begged. "I don't know who else to turn to." Sophia invited her inside, her heart thumping. She had sensed this moment would come. Someone would eventually come to her, seeking the help she had once desperately sought. But now, with all the wisdom she had accumulated, she realized this wasn't just about helping someone. It was about guiding them to find their own balance, their own path. The woman's name was Clara, and as she explained her predicament, Sophia could hear the echo of her past in Clara's voice, the same fear, the same urgent need for a solution, a quick fix. She spoke of strange occurrences, disturbances in her house, whispers in the dark, objects moving by themselves. The signs of a curse, or so she believed. Sophia listened patiently, her calm presence a stark contrast to Clara's frantic energy. But as the young woman went on, Sophia noticed something troubling. Clara wasn't looking for guidance. She was looking for someone to simply erase her fear. She wanted an exorcism, a ritual, something definitive. She wanted to be saved from her own shadow. Sophia felt a tightening in her chest. She could help, of course, but this wasn't the way to approach it. This wasn't how healing worked. Clara, Sophia said, her voice steady, I can help you, but it won't be by casting out the darkness. Clara's eyes widened. What do you mean? That's what I've always been told to do. You banish the evil. You get rid of the curse. Sophia sighed softly, taking a deep breath. What if the darkness isn't evil? What if it's a part of you, and what you need isn't to banish it, but to understand it? Clara shook her head, her face contorting with fear. No, I don't want to understand it. I want it gone. I want peace. Sophia could feel the desperation in Clara's voice, the same desperation she had once known. But she also understood now that this wasn't something that could be solved by a quick fix. True healing required more than rituals. It required a shift in perspective. I know what you're going through, Sophia said softly. I've been where you are. I thought the darkness was something to fear, something that needed to be destroyed. But I've learned that darkness isn't something to fight. It's something to embrace, to integrate. Clara recoiled, almost as if the words themselves were a threat. You want me to accept it? Sophia nodded. Not accept it as something that defines you, but as something that exists within you. It's not the curse that controls you, Clara. It's your fear of it. The more you resist it, the stronger it becomes. But when you learn to face it, to live with it, that's when it loses its power. Clara stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. But deep down, Sophia could see the flicker of something else, the spark of curiosity. It was the same spark that had ignited within her months ago. I don't know if I can do that, Clara said quietly. Sophia smiled a small, knowing smile. You don't have to do it alone. Let me help you understand your darkness. Together, we can find a way to live with it. The next few weeks were a delicate dance of trust and understanding. Clara, like Sophia once had, struggled with the notion that the very thing she feared could be a source of strength. But Sophia was patient, guiding her through the same process she had gone through: journaling, meditation, and quiet contemplation. They started small. Sophia encouraged Clara to sit with her fear, to observe it without judgment. The first few days were filled with resistance. Clara would storm out of the room in frustration, convinced that Sophia was asking her to give up the fight. But as the days wore on, something began to shift. Clara started to notice small changes. The whispers at night became less intrusive, the strange occurrences slowed, and for the first time, she slept soundly without the constant fear of what was lurking in the dark. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of Sophia's living room, Clara finally spoke up. I think I understand now. Her voice was quiet, almost tentative. The darkness doesn't own me. It's a part of me, and when I stop running from it, I don't feel so afraid. Sophia smiled warmly. Exactly. You've already begun the first step, acceptance. Clara's eyes softened. Thank you, Sophia. I never would have thought of it that way. You've helped me see that the curse isn't a punishment. It's a part of who I am. Sophia's heart swelled with pride. This was why she had embraced the darkness. Not just for her own peace, but to help others see that there was no need to live in fear of what they couldn't control. Darkness and light were two halves of the same whole. As the months passed, Clara's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She no longer viewed her home as a haunted place. Instead, it became a sanctuary, a place where she could live with her shadow, not in fear of it. She continued to work with Sophia, delving deeper into her own soul, uncovering aspects of herself she had long buried. The bond between the two women grew stronger as they shared this journey together. Sophia realized that while she had freed herself from the curse, she still had much to learn. Each person she helped, each story she encountered, added layers to her own understanding. Sophia's legacy was not one of defeating the darkness, but of helping others find their own power through acceptance. She became a guide for those who sought balance, teaching them that true peace came not from rejecting parts of themselves, but from integrating them into the whole. And as she continued to walk this path, Sophia realized something even more profound. She was not alone. There would always be others like her, those who would struggle, those who would fear. But by sharing her wisdom, she could help them walk their own path to understanding. The darkness no longer held power over her or anyone else. It was simply a part of the journey, an integral part of the human experience. Months passed in a quiet, peaceful rhythm. Clara's life had transformed, and Sophia felt the deep satisfaction of having helped someone reclaim their own power. But in the back of her mind, she knew that this peace wouldn't last forever. The darkness had not been vanquished. It had simply been accepted, integrated. She had a sense that there would always be others, lost and confused, seeking answers in the same way that she once had. And so, when the knock came on her door one late afternoon, Sophia wasn't entirely surprised. The man standing in her doorway was older than Clara, in his mid-40s, with dark hair that had begun to show the first hints of gray. His posture was rigid, his eyes guarded, but there was something desperate behind them, a fear that was palpable even before he spoke. "I need your help," he said, his voice tight. Sophia invited him in, sensing the weight of something ancient in his presence. There was a look in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, a recognition, though she didn't know how or why. She asked him to sit. "My name is Daniel," he began, pacing the room. "I've heard whispers about you, about your ability to help people with the darkness." Sophia's heart skipped. She knew that people who sought her help usually came from a place of fear and desperation, but Daniel's urgency felt different. He wasn't just afraid. He was haunted, as though he'd been carrying something inside him for years. "What's going on?" she asked gently, sensing that his story was far deeper than simple curse breaking. Daniel stopped pacing and met her gaze. His eyes were shadowed with years of weariness. "I don't know how to explain this, but I've been carrying something for as long as I can remember. A darkness that I can't escape. It follows me, and it's not just in me. It's in my family, my bloodline." His voice wavered for a moment. "I didn't know how bad it was until recently. I thought I could live with it, bury it like my ancestors did. But I was wrong. It's worse than I thought." Sophia's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean worse?" Daniel swallowed hard. "It's coming back. The creature from the old stories. The one that's been passed down through generations of my family. It's not just a story. It's real, and it's coming after me." Sophia's heart sank, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the cold stir of fear in her own chest. She recognized what he was describing, a creature of the shadow, an ancient entity that thrived on fear and destruction. It had been a part of her family's curse as well, but she had thought it gone, erased. "Why now?" she asked. "Why after all these years?" "I don't know," Daniel said, shaking his head. "But I'm starting to see the signs. The same things that happened to my ancestors before they disappeared. Strange occurrences, unexplainable phenomena. It's as if the creature is reaching out again, and this time it wants to finish what it started." Sophia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just some random curse. This was something far older, something rooted in the very fabric of her family's bloodline, a shadow that had refused to fade away. Daniel's story echoed all too familiar to Sophia. She had been there herself, when the darkness seemed all-encompassing, when the creatures of the night were no longer mere figments of imagination, but real threats to her existence. But now, after everything she had learned about embracing the shadow, she knew that this wasn't a matter of mere survival. This wasn't about fighting a monster or a curse. This was about confronting something far deeper, something woven into the very nature of their lineage. The more Daniel spoke, the clearer it became that this creature, this force, was not just an external threat. It was a manifestation of the darkest corners of their ancestors' fears, an inheritance that had been passed down generation after generation, feeding on the unresolved trauma, guilt, and anger that had never been addressed. The creature wasn't just a curse. It was a reflection of the unhealed wounds buried deep within their family's past. Sophia's thoughts were a whirl of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt the pull of her old instincts, the urge to protect, to destroy the threat before it could hurt anyone else. But on the other hand, she knew that destroying the creature wouldn't solve anything. It wasn't the creature that needed to be confronted. It was the legacy of fear that had allowed it to exist. "I've tried everything," Daniel continued. "I've researched every method, every ritual. But it doesn't work. It only gets worse." It's as if the creature's power grows stronger with every failed attempt. Sophia closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the edges of her chair. She had to admit it. Daniel's situation was far worse than hers had ever been. This wasn't just a cursed house or a single manifestation of fear. This was a centuries-old entity, one that had fed on her bloodline's ignorance and denial. And she knew that if she was to help him, it wouldn't be by using the same methods that had failed him. She couldn't just try to banish this darkness. She had to teach him what she had learned. That true healing could only come when one learned to live with the darkness, not fight it. "Daniel," she said softly, "what if the problem isn't the creature? What if the problem is your fear of it?" He stared at her confused. "What do you mean?" Sophia exhaled slowly. "What if the creature is only as strong as the fear we give it? What if instead of trying to fight it, we could understand it, learn to live with it, so it no longer has the power to control us?" Daniel looked at her as though she had just suggested the impossible. "Are you saying that we should accept it? That it's something we have to live with?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, but we can't do it alone. I'm not asking you to face this creature head-on without help. What I'm saying is that the creature is a manifestation of everything we're afraid to confront in ourselves. It feeds on the secrets, the unresolved emotions, the parts of ourselves we've buried so deep that we don't even know they exist. If we learn to confront those parts, to integrate them, we can neutralize the creature's power." Daniel's face hardened as though he was about to protest, but Sophia raised a hand. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything, to pretend it didn't happen. I'm asking you to acknowledge the truth. The truth about what your family has been through, about the fear that has been passed down, and about the darkness you've been running from. Only then will you be able to understand the creature's true nature." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with skepticism. "And how do we start?" Sophia smiled, her heart steady. "We begin by facing the truth. Together." Sophia and Daniel began the difficult process of uncovering the hidden wounds of his family's past. They didn't begin with rituals or exorcisms. They began with stories, with the painful and often forgotten history of his ancestors. As they worked together, Daniel uncovered long-buried secrets, hidden guilt, betrayal, unhealed trauma. The darkness that had followed his family for generations wasn't simply a supernatural force. It was the result of old wounds that had never been allowed to heal. The more they uncovered, the more Sophia understood. The creature, the manifestation of all their collective fear, had thrived on these unresolved emotions. But now, as Daniel came to terms with his family's past, he began to see the creature for what it truly was. Not an external monster, but a part of himself, his fear, his anger, his inherited guilt. And as Daniel's acceptance deepened, the creature's power slowly began to wane. The day finally came when Daniel stood face to face with the creature. It wasn't an epic battle or a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, personal moment of reckoning, where the darkness was no longer something to fight, but something to understand. And in that moment, as Daniel acknowledged the creature within him, The darkness faded into the background. Sophia stood at his side, watching as the creature lost its power. It was no longer a force of destruction. It was a reflection of all that Daniel had come to terms with. It was part of him, but it didn't control him anymore. Together, they had healed the wounds of the past. Together, they had learned to live with the darkness. Sophia sat quietly by her window, the night stretching out before her in a tapestry of shifting shadows and pale moonlight. The work with Daniel had been difficult, transformative, yes, but deeply unsettling in ways she hadn't anticipated. For all the progress he'd made, there was still a lingering sense of unease, an echo of the darkness that had once dominated her own life. The doorbell rang, snapping her out of her reverie. Sophia stood and made her way to the door, sensing that this new arrival would mark another significant change in her life. She opened it to find a familiar face. Clara. Clara had been doing well since their first meeting, a steady and transformative process of integration and self-acceptance. Her energy had shifted from fearful and desperate to quiet and contemplative. But now, standing before Sophia, Clara looked different. Her eyes were wide with an unfamiliar tension, her hands trembling as if she were carrying some unspoken burden. I don't know who else to turn to, Clara said, her voice tight with worry. I feel like something is wrong, Sophia. Something I can't explain. It's like the darkness is back, but it's not mine this time. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Not hers? It had been weeks since their last session, and Clara had been steadily building her own life, no longer haunted by the fear of the past. Come in, Sophia urged, stepping aside to let Clara into the house. Tell me everything. What are you feeling? Clara sank into a chair, wringing her hands. I can't even put it into words. It feels like a presence. Oh wait, it's like something has followed me, but it's not mine to claim. I thought it was gone, but now, it's here again. I'm scared, Sophia. Sophia nodded slowly, sensing the shift. This was different. Clara was no longer dealing with her own darkness. This felt like something external, something that had latched onto her, a shadow she hadn't been able to shake. Tell me about your life recently, Sophia said, sitting across from her, watching her closely. Has anything changed? Anyone new? Any place you visited? Clara paused, her face crinkling with thought. There's this man. I've been seeing him for a while. At first, everything seemed fine, but lately it's like something is off. He doesn't have the same energy anymore. He's distant cold, and every time I look into his eyes, I feel like there's something wrong, like he's carrying something that's not his own. Sophia's heart clenched. It wasn't a curse this time. It wasn't even a direct shadow of Clara's own making. This felt like something that had attached itself to another person, an energy, a force, or maybe even a piece of someone else's unresolved darkness. A parasite of sorts, feeding on the other person and, in turn, threatening to consume Clara. Do you trust him? Sophia asked. I don't know, Clara whispered. I want to, but I don't know who he really is anymore. The man I met isn't the man I see now. Sophia took a deep breath, considering the implications. This wasn't just about helping Clara understand the nature of her own shadows. This was an external force, one that had attached itself to someone close to her, using that connection to reach her. She had to act quickly. Clara, we need to help him, Sophia said, her voice firm. But we also need to protect you. This thing, it feeds on doubt, on fear, and it knows how to manipulate people, how to tear them apart from the inside. We'll confront this, but we can't do it alone. We need to see what's truly going on. Clara's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but Sophia could see that she was beginning to trust her once more. She had to. Are you ready to face this together? Sophia asked, her tone softening. Clara hesitated, but then nodded, her lips trembling. I am. I have to be. The following days were filled with preparation. Sophia and Clara met in secret, discussing what steps to take, what tools to use, and how to ensure that Clara was emotionally ready to confront this new force. Sophia knew that the best way to understand the presence Clara was feeling was to visit the source, the man she had been seeing. His name was Thomas. The man Clara spoke of had been a charming, engaging figure when they first met. But Sophia knew that charm could often conceal darker truths. It was rare for someone's energy to shift so abruptly unless something had changed within them. Something perhaps forced, perhaps invisible. And if that something wasn't a part of Clara's own past, then it had to be something attached to Thomas. Sophia agreed to meet Clara and Thomas in person. She had no intention of confronting Thomas aggressively, but she knew she needed to observe him, feel his energy, and see if she could identify what was lurking beneath the surface. That night, they met at a small cafe in town. Thomas arrived first. He was tall, with dark eyes that flickered nervously when he noticed Sophia's gaze on him. Clara, looking more fragile than usual, walked in a moment later, trying to appear composed, though Sophia could see her discomfort. Sophia greeted Thomas with a warm, calm smile. There was a certain unease in the air as she extended her hand toward him. "You're Clara's friend, right?" Thomas said, his voice a little too tight, too controlled. Sophia could sense the walls he'd built around himself, tightly wrapped in defense, a person who was trying to project confidence, but was losing the battle to something beneath the surface. "Yes, I'm Sophia," she replied smoothly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Thomas." Clara sat down next to Thomas, her nervousness palpable. She kept her eyes on her hands, her fingers twisting around each other. Sophia didn't miss the way Thomas's gaze darted between Clara and herself, nor the way his shoulders seemed to tense when he looked at her. "What do you do, Thomas?" Sophia asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "I work in tech, programming mostly." "It's not very interesting," he replied, though the words felt rehearsed, as if he were trying to control the interaction. His voice was just a touch too high, his smile a little too forced. Sophia studied him closely, letting her intuition guide her. There was something lurking beneath his surface, something unnatural, like an energy that didn't belong. She could almost feel it, faintly, like an oily layer over his aura. And then she saw it. For a brief moment, she glimpsed the shadow that hung over Thomas, an aura that flickered with the intensity of an old pain, a seething undercurrent of rage and sorrow. It wasn't his darkness, but something he had absorbed, a burden carried from someone else, a lingering fragment of a deeper curse. It was a force that had latched onto him, feeding off his fears and insecurities, twisting them into something that now threatened Clara. Sophia turned to Clara, whose face had grown pale. She saw it too, the confusion, the realization. This wasn't Thomas. At least not entirely. "I think we need to talk," Sophia said softly, guiding Clara to the side, away from Thomas. Away from Thomas, Clara's eyes welled with tears. She hadn't understood it at first, but now she saw the truth. The man she loved wasn't the one being consumed by darkness. He was the vessel for it. The entity was feeding on his unresolved trauma, twisting him into something unrecognizable. "We need to face it," Sophia said gently. "You can't save him if you don't face the shadow that's within him. And to do that, you'll need to face your own darkness as well." Clara nodded, though she was still shaken. The entity wouldn't be exorcised in the traditional way. This would require confronting the pain in both Thomas and Clara, teaching them to face the shadows within themselves and, through that, sever the link that bound the creature to Thomas's spirit. Sophia's heart beat a little faster, the weight of what was to come settling on her. But she knew this was the next step in her journey. Not just for Clara, for herself as well. It wasn't about fighting the shadows. It was about freeing the trapped light within each person. That was the ultimate power. In the days that followed, Sophia helped Clara and Thomas begin the long, difficult process of confronting their pasts. With her guidance, they faced the hidden truths, the unresolved fears, and the emotions they had long buried. Slowly, The entity that had latched onto Thomas began to lose its grip. It was no longer an outside force controlling them. It was something they learned to integrate and understand. And in doing so, it began to fade, no longer able to feed off their fears. The shadow had been conquered, not by exorcism, but by understanding, healing, and integration. Sophia's journey, and the healing she brought to others, continued to unfold in ways she hadn't expected. Each encounter pushed her deeper into her own understanding of the balance between light and dark. This was her legacy now, to teach others how to embrace the shadows, how to live with them, and ultimately, how to transform them into something that no longer held power over their lives. Days passed since Thomas had confronted the shadow within him, the entity that had latched onto his fear and unresolved pain. Sophia had watched with a careful, measured distance as Clara and Thomas struggled to integrate their pasts. There were moments of relief, yes, but there were also setbacks, clashes between their unresolved emotions and their attempts at healing. Sophia knew that healing was not linear, but even she had to admit that something wasn't sitting right with her. A fracture, something deep within the process, was nagging at her thoughts. Clara had done so much work to understand herself, to move past the remnants of fear. But now, her recovery seemed stalled. She'd stopped coming to see Sophia as often, retreating inwardly, and Sophia could sense that something had shifted in Clara's energy. She was growing distant again. Sophia could feel the tightness in her chest, the creeping suspicion that she had missed something. She decided to pay Clara a visit. Clara's apartment was eerily quiet when Sophia arrived. The air in the small living room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if something had taken root in the space, filling it with an unease that Sophia could almost touch. The warmth Clara had once radiated seemed to have dimmed, replaced with a coldness that made Sophia's skin prickle. Clara answered the door with a weak smile. Her eyes, though, betrayed the truth. They were tired, dark rings under them, her expression strained. "I wasn't expecting you," Clara said, stepping aside to let Sophia in. "I know," Sophia said gently, noticing the way Clara's eyes flicked nervously to the corners of the room, as though she feared being watched. "Can we talk?" Clara nodded, though her mouth twisted with uncertainty. She led Sophia to the couch and sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Something's not right," Sophia said, her voice low. "I can feel it. You're holding something back." Clara's lips parted as though to speak, but she hesitated, glancing down at her hands. Finally, she whispered, "I've been feeling it again. The weight, the pressure. It's like something is watching me, something that's always been here. But I can't tell if it's from the past or something new." Sophia's breath caught. She had been right. Something had changed in Clara. But the question was, what? "Is it the shadow?" Sophia asked. "Thomas." Clara shook her head quickly. "No, it's not Thomas. It's something older. I thought I was free of it, but I feel it creeping back in. It's like the walls are closing in. I can't escape it." Sophia's heart began to race. Could it be? Had the darkness, one that had once sought to consume her, found its way back into Clara's life? Sophia closed her eyes, grounding herself in the present. The shadow wasn't a mere force to banish. It was a presence, a reflection of unresolved emotions, and Clara had already done so much work. But perhaps something deeper needed to be confronted. "What are you afraid of, Clara?" Sophia asked softly. Clara's shoulders slumped, her head falling into her hands. "I don't know. It's like I'm afraid to look at myself. Like I'm afraid of what I'll find. I thought I had accepted everything, but maybe I haven't. Maybe it's too much to hold." Sophia reached out, placing a gentle hand on Clara's. "It's okay to be afraid, but we don't heal by ignoring what's there. We face it, together." Clara raised her tear-filled eyes to Sophia's. "But what if there's something I'm not supposed to see? What if this shadow is me?" Sophia's heart went still. Was it possible? Had Clara unknowingly been holding on to something that wasn't just the product of external fear? Had her own darkness been waiting, buried beneath the surface, untouched? The answer felt close, but distant. Sophia made a decision. They needed to dig deeper into Clara's past, unearth everything that had been buried, even the parts that felt like they were too dangerous to confront. Clara's fear was not only about what was happening now. It was a fear that had been seeded long ago, in the past she hadn't fully processed. Sophia returned to the study and pulled out the journal where she had chronicled her own journey into the shadow. She couldn't help but notice how her life had been intricately tied to the shadows of those she helped. The way one person's darkness could call to another's. The first step, she knew, was to guide Clara into understanding her fears better, seeing what had been ignored or hidden for too long. They had to face what lurked beneath the surface. But this time, the stakes were different. It wasn't just about healing one person. It was about learning to recognize the shadow in its various forms, the way it could take root in unexpected places. That night, they sat together in Clara's apartment, the tension between them thick. Clara's energy was distant, still unsettled by what she had felt in the past few days. Sophia lit a candle, the flame flickering as she asked Clara to sit across from her. They needed to go deeper into the work. "Close your eyes," Sophia whispered. "Take a deep breath. Inhale the light. Exhale the fear." Clara obeyed, her body trembling slightly. Sophia reached out, placing her hand gently over Clara's chest. "I want you to visualize your heart as a garden. It's beautiful, filled with blooming flowers. But somewhere in that garden, there's a dark spot. It might be small, or it might be large, but it's there. Can you see it?" Clara's breathing became shallow. "I can. It's dark and tangled, and it feels like it's been there for a long time." "Good. Now," Sophia continued softly, "I want you to walk toward that dark spot. Let it draw you in, but know that you're safe. You control the space. The darkness doesn't control you." Clara hesitated, but then nodded. "I'm walking toward it." Sophia's hand gently brushed Clara's arm. "What do you see, Clara?" Clara's voice wavered. "There's a figure standing in the center of the darkness. I can't see its face, but I know it's waiting for me. It's familiar." Sophia's heart dropped. The darkness Clara was confronting wasn't just a force. It was something personal. Something from her past. Perhaps even someone. "Who is it?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes fluttered open, her face pale. "It's my mother." Sophia remained silent, allowing Clara the space to process. Clara's relationship with her mother had always been strained in ways that Clara hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the fear of confronting old wounds, ones that had never been properly healed. The shadow that had once seemed so external was now revealed to be a deep internal wound. Clara's mother, a person who had long been a source of pain and resentment, but whose influence had shaped Clara's life in ways she hadn't been able to fully recognize until now. Sophia understood now. The presence Clara had felt was not something from an outside force. It was an echo, a manifestation of her unresolved trauma. The ghost of her mother, lingering in her subconscious, waiting to be acknowledged. The healing would not be easy, but it had to be done. The room felt heavier now, as though Clara's past was pressing in from all sides. The air hummed with tension as Clara sat in front of Sophia, her eyes wide with realization and fear. The figure that had appeared in her vision, the darkness that had gripped her so tightly, was her mother. Sophia had suspected this might be the case, but now that it was out in the open, Clara was struggling to face it. Sophia sat quietly for a moment, allowing Clara the space to breathe, to process the revelation. Clara had always been so connected to the emotions of others, so compassionate and open, but that same open-heartedness had left her vulnerable. Her relationship with her mother, once a source of confusion, was now revealed to be the root of much of her inner turmoil. Clara, Sophia said softly, tell me more about your mother. What do you remember from your childhood with her? Clara shook her head, as if trying to block out the memories that flooded her mind. I remember feeling like I was never good enough for her. She was always distant. She would criticize everything I did. If I showed excitement or joy, she'd tear it down, say it was too much. If I showed sadness, she'd ignore it like it wasn't real. Sophia's heart ached for her. Clara's words rang out with a familiar note of neglect and emotional manipulation, something that often left deep scars on a person's spirit. Clara had grown up in an environment where love was conditional, where her worth was defined by an impossible standard that no one, especially not her mother, could ever truly meet. I never felt like I was truly seen, Clara continued, her voice trembling. And when she would leave, disappear for days at a time, it was like I was left to fend for myself. I thought I could make her love me if I just tried harder, did better. But nothing was ever enough. I kept wondering what I was doing wrong. Sophia's brow furrowed as she listened. The neglect, the emotional abandonment, this had shaped Clara into the woman she was today. It had created a deep-seated fear of abandonment, a fear of not being good enough, of being invisible. And now, as an adult, that same fear was manifesting as a shadow, haunting her every move. This darkness, Sophia murmured, it's not just a shadow you're fighting. It's an echo of your mother's treatment of you. It's the fear she instilled in you, the sense that you weren't worthy of love unless you were perfect. Clara closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. But I'm trying, Sophia. I am trying. I've worked so hard to move past it, to be okay, to not let her affect me. But I keep feeling like she's still there, like I can't escape her. Sophia's heart broke for Clara in that moment. It was clear now that the struggle wasn't just against the shadow or the fear. It was against the deep wounds of the past that had never been healed. The mother who had emotionally abandoned her had left a hole in Clara's heart, and it was still affecting her, even now. We're going to face this, Sophia said firmly, squeezing Clara's hand. Not alone. Together. You don't have to carry this anymore. In the following days, Clara's healing took on a different form. Sophia guided her through the process of revisiting her memories. But this time, Clara would not face them alone. They would confront the emotional ghosts head-on, standing together against the trauma that had defined Clara's past. The work would be difficult, but it was necessary if Clara was ever to free herself from the grip of her mother's lingering presence. Sophia asked Clara to prepare for one of the most important steps in the healing process, a confrontation with her mother's spirit. Not in the physical world, but within the safe space they had created in her subconscious mind. It would be a chance to speak the words Clara had never said, to express the pain, the hurt, and the anger that had been bottled up for so long. I don't know if I'm ready, Clara admitted one afternoon as they sat in the quiet, dimly lit room of Sophia's study. Sophia placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be ready in the way you think. You just have to trust that you have the strength to face this. The courage to say what's been left unsaid for so long. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with doubt, but also a flicker of hope. The following night, they began the session. Clara sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her knees, as Sophia guided her into a deep meditative state. Clara, I want you to return to that garden in your mind, the place we created before, Sophia instructed. Find the darkness again, the shadow that has been haunting you. But this time, stand in front of it. Are you ready to face it? Clara nodded, her breathing steady but tense. In her mind, Clara walked toward the shadow, the space growing colder, darker as she approached. And there, standing at the center of the blackness, was the figure of her mother. Her features were blurred, but Clara could feel her presence, the harshness, the disapproval, the cold distance that had defined their relationship. Sophia's voice came through softly, like a whisper in Clara's ear. This is your chance, Clara. Speak to her. Say everything you've needed to say. Clara's breath hitched in her chest. She had been avoiding this moment for years, running from the confrontation that could finally bring her peace. But now, in the safety of her own mind, Clara stepped forward. She felt a surge of emotion, the years of anger, pain, and hurt rising within her. "I hate you," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "I hate how you made me feel invisible, like I wasn't worthy of love. I hate how you treated me like I was a burden, like nothing I did was ever enough. I've spent my whole life trying to prove something to you, trying to make you love me, but I realize now that I don't need you to love me. I just need to love myself." The words, at first so quiet and tentative, grew stronger with each breath. Clara's voice grew louder as she poured out her feelings, confronting the hurt that had been festering inside her for so long. "You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to have power over my life. I am enough. I always have been, and I'm done letting you dictate who I am." As Clara spoke these words, the shadow before her flickered, shifting as if it were unraveling. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, as though the darkness that had clung to Clara for so long was finally beginning to dissipate. Sophia's voice came again, more softly now. "You've done it, Clara. You've freed yourself." When Clara finally opened her eyes, she found herself back in the present, sitting across from Sophia in the quiet room. Her body felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She glanced at Sophia, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I did it," Clara said, her voice trembling but filled with awe. "I really did it." Sophia smiled warmly. "Yes, you did. You confronted the darkness and claimed your own power. Now, you get to decide what happens next." Clara looked at her hands, flexing her fingers as if she could feel the energy flowing through her. "I feel different, free, somehow." Sophia nodded. "Healing is a process, but you've made a huge step today. And remember, Clara, you don't have to face this alone. The darkness can come in many forms, but you have the strength to face it." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara felt truly free. She had faced the ghosts of her past and reclaimed her life, piece by piece. Sophia's work with Clara was far from over, but they had reached a new chapter. One where Clara would learn to integrate the lessons she had learned and continue her path toward healing, one step at a time. The next few days felt like an emotional cleanse for Clara. She no longer felt the oppressive weight of her mother's shadow looming over her every move. The anger, the sadness, and the deep-rooted fear had all been acknowledged, expressed, and most importantly, released. Clara found herself breathing deeper, feeling lighter, as though a fog that had clouded her mind for years had finally dissipated. But there was still work to be done. Healing, after all, was not a singular moment. It was a journey that continued to unfold, each step a new discovery. Sophia, too, noticed the difference in Clara's energy. There was a warmth now, a vibrancy in her that had been absent for so long. It was as if the woman who had entered Sophia's life weeks ago was not the same person. There was more clarity in her gaze, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Yet, despite all this progress, a lingering question remained. How would Clara's recovery impact her relationships with others, especially with Thomas? Their bond had always been strong, but now that Clara had begun to heal, there was a new dynamic forming, one that could change everything. Meanwhile, Thomas had been making progress of his own. The work he had done to confront his own shadows had been intense. He had released much of the fear and doubt that had held him captive for so long. Yet, he still felt a pull and need to protect Clara, to fix her, to shield her from the things that still haunted her. But Clara was different now. She didn't need fixing. She was healing on her own. Sophia had noticed the tension between them. It wasn't the type of tension that came from anger or frustration. It was something deeper, something unspoken. A subtle, emotional undercurrent that seemed to wrap around both Clara and Thomas, pulling them closer, but also creating distance. Sophia decided it was time to have a conversation with Thomas. The next evening, Thomas met Sophia at her study, his face a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He knew that there was something that needed to be said, something that had been left unsaid for far too long. "I've been noticing something," Sophia began, her voice calm but firm. "The way you've been interacting with Clara. It seems like you're holding back. I know it's hard, but she's not the same person she was. You don't need to protect her anymore. You need to let her be who she is." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, avoiding Sophia's eyes. "I know. I'm not sure what to do with this change. I don't want to lose her, Sophia. I don't want to stand by and watch her drift away." Sophia's expression softened. "Thomas, healing isn't about holding on to the past. It's about letting go. It's about embracing the person Clara is becoming. If you keep trying to hold on to the person she used to be, you're doing her a disservice. You're not giving her the space to grow." Thomas sighed heavily, the weight of the words settling in. "I don't know how to let go, though. She means so much to me." Sophia nodded, understanding. "She does, but she's not the same person anymore. And if you truly care about her, you'll allow her to evolve. You need to trust that she's capable of taking care of herself." The next few days were filled with uncertainty as both Clara and Thomas tried to navigate the new spaces that had opened between them. Clara, for the first time, felt like she could breathe freely without the constant pressure of trying to live up to something she could never be. She was discovering herself anew, carving out a path that wasn't dictated by fear or past trauma. But with this newfound freedom came an unexpected loneliness. Clara had never been alone before, not in the way she was now. She had always defined herself by the relationships around her, by how others saw her, how they loved her, or rather, how they didn't. Now, she was learning to define herself in a different way, and that meant letting go of some old attachments, even ones that had seemed comforting in their familiarity. One evening, as Clara and Thomas sat together in the quiet of her apartment, the silence between them felt suffocating. Clara could sense that something was different, but she didn't know how to address it. Her heart felt heavy, but she wasn't sure why. Thomas finally spoke, breaking the silence that had hung over them like a thick fog. "I've been holding back," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been trying to protect you, Clara. I thought that if I kept trying to save you, everything would stay the same. But I see now that it's not helping. It's not what you need." Clara looked at him, her heart aching. She knew the intentions behind his actions, but it wasn't enough. She wasn't the person she had been when she first met him. "You don't have to protect me anymore, Thomas," Clara said softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. "I don't need to be fixed. I'm healing. I need you to see that. I need you to let me grow." Thomas's eyes filled with emotion as he nodded. "I know. I don't want to lose you." Clara reached out, taking his hand. "You're not going to lose me, but I need space to be who I am now. And I need you to find yourself too. We're both on separate journeys, but we're still in this together. Just differently." There was a long silence between them, but this time, it was a peaceful one. They both understood that healing, while deeply personal, didn't have to mean separation. It just meant growing. The weeks that followed were full of quiet change. Thomas began to embrace his own healing in a deeper way. He realized that his attachment to Clara had been driven by a desire to fix her, to make things right. But now he could see that it was his own journey he needed to focus on. It was time for him to stop holding Clara's healing as his responsibility and instead start walking alongside her. For Clara, the work she had done with Sophia and the confrontation with her mother had opened up new possibilities. She began to understand what it truly meant to be herself. The more she explored her identity, the more confident she became in the space she had created for herself. And yet, even as they both navigated their personal journeys, the bond between them remained. It was evolving, shifting, but not dissolving. They had both grown, both learned that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing change, confronting the shadows, and allowing themselves to be whole again. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. And with each passing day, They became more comfortable with who they were, separately and together. The road ahead was still long. Healing never truly ends. But Clara and Thomas were learning to embrace the ongoing process. They had found a new rhythm in their relationship, one that allowed space for both of them to grow and evolve. And with each step they took, they discovered that sometimes the most healing thing of all is simply letting go of the past, letting go of the fears, and letting go of the idea that they had to save each other. They had already saved themselves. The days that followed were peaceful, but Clara could feel the undercurrent of tension that lingered. It wasn't as overwhelming as it had once been, but there were moments when the quiet would become too loud, and she'd catch herself questioning if everything was truly okay. The silence between Clara and Thomas was no longer one of distance. It was filled with unspoken things, like both of them trying to find new ways to exist within the same space. Clara had begun to embrace the idea of herself as someone who wasn't defined by her past, and yet there were times when memories would resurface, unwelcome, fleeting. The shadow of her mother, though no longer the constant weight it once was, still lingered like a half-forgotten nightmare, ready to creep back into her thoughts. But it wasn't just Clara who was struggling with these shadows. Thomas, too, was haunted. As he worked through his own past, he found that his own fears and insecurities started to rise to the surface. The protective instincts he had held on to so tightly had begun to unwind, and now that he could see Clara more clearly, he realized just how much of his own identity had been wrapped up in trying to shield her from the world. They had been moving forward, learning to live alongside their healing, not apart from it. But that didn't mean it was easy. In fact, the harder parts of their journey were just beginning. Clara had spent weeks reconnecting with herself, exploring new hobbies, revisiting old passions. She had even begun writing again, the act of putting pen to paper allowing her to process her emotions and thoughts. But just when she felt like she was standing on solid ground, doubts crept back in. She had always been an empathetic person, but now she felt as though her empathy was being stretched to its limit. As she navigated her own recovery, she was also feeling a deeper connection to others around her, the people who had been affected by her pain. One night, as Clara sat at the kitchen table, looking over the journal she had started to fill with her thoughts, Thomas came in quietly, leaning against the doorframe. His presence, though familiar, felt heavier than usual. Clara looked up at him and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had learned to recognize the subtle signs in him, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking too hard, the way he seemed to always be holding something back. "Everything okay?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. Thomas hesitated, his gaze distant. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, taking a step into the room. "About us, about what we've been through. And I think I'm afraid. Afraid that we're just trying to hold on to something that's already changed too much." Clara's heart sank. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear this conversation, but she couldn't shy away from it. She set the journal aside and gestured for him to sit down. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think we're both healing," Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But the more I look at it, the more I realize that maybe what we had before, it's not the same. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing." Clara swallowed, the room suddenly feeling smaller. "You're saying that you and I, might not be the same anymore." Thomas nodded, a pained expression on his face. "I think we both changed. And while that's good, I don't know if we can still find a way to be the same with each other." Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She wasn't sure what was more difficult, the weight of his words or the fear of what they meant. She had wanted to believe that their connection, the bond they shared, could transcend the pain and the healing process. But hearing him say it out loud brought it all into stark clarity. Could they still be the people they once were to each other? Or was that love now part of the past? A beautiful memory they couldn't return to? "I don't want to lose you, Thomas," Clara said softly, her voice trembling. "But I don't want us to hold on to something that's already gone, either. I need to find my own path forward, just like you need to find yours." Thomas looked down at his hands. as if the words were too heavy to hold. I don't want to hold you back, Clara. I need to figure out who I am too. Not just as your partner, but as me. Clara stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. And I need that too. We've been through so much, but we can't keep living in the shadows of our past. For a moment, they stood in silence, the space between them filled with an unspoken understanding. They were both in the midst of their own healing, their own journeys. And though they loved each other deeply, they realized that their paths were no longer as intertwined as they once had been. The next few days were filled with moments of reflection. Clara and Thomas didn't break up, at least not in the traditional sense. They didn't have a dramatic fight, nor did they call it quits out of anger. Instead, they gave each other the space to breathe, to grow individually, and to confront what they both needed in their lives. Clara found herself embracing this new form of independence. She took long walks through the city, spending hours in the local park or at the coffee shop she used to frequent. The more she learned about herself, the more she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just Clara the daughter, Clara the partner, or Clara the healer. She was Clara, whole and separate from everything that had defined her before. Thomas, too, found solace in the space they had created between them. He joined a group of men who had been through similar challenges, men who had struggled with their own identities, their own demons. In those conversations, he began to find pieces of himself he had long forgotten. They spoke less often, but when they did, it was no longer about expectations or the need to save one another. It was about a deep respect for the individual journeys they were both on. They had both grown, perhaps in different directions, but they no longer saw that as a loss. Weeks passed, and while their bond had shifted, it had not completely unraveled. They were learning to live alongside the changes, no longer clinging to the version of themselves they had been before. And in that space of both distance and closeness, they began to see the possibility of new beginnings. Not just as a couple, but as two individuals carving out their own futures. One morning, Clara stood at the edge of a quiet lake, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the water. The air was crisp, and the world felt still, a world of infinite possibilities. She had come here for clarity, to let her mind wander, and to finally let herself be at peace with everything she had learned. As she looked at the water's surface, she realized that the reflection staring back at her was not someone she recognized from the past. It was someone new, a woman who had been through the fire, who had faced her demons and come out on the other side. And as she stood there, letting the sun warm her face, she understood. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Though the quiet lake had provided Clara with a moment of peace, the reflection she saw in the water was not without its cracks. She had walked away from the past, but the path ahead was still uncertain. There was so much she had yet to discover about herself, so many layers left unexplored. For the first time in years, Clara was standing on her own, free from the emotional weight of her mother's expectations. But even with this newfound freedom, there were moments when doubt crept in, when she questioned whether she was strong enough to navigate the world on her own. And then there was Thomas. Though they had agreed to give each other space, it was impossible to ignore the lingering emotional pull between them. Their bond was complicated, woven with shared history and lingering love. But both of them knew that their relationship could no longer be what it had been. They couldn't simply pick up where they left off. Clara returned to her apartment that afternoon, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't seen Thomas in days, and while part of her missed him, another part of her felt the relief of space. Space to grow, space to breathe. But the distance also felt like a fracture, one that neither of them knew how to mend. As she stepped into the entryway of her apartment, she was startled to find a letter on the doorstep. It was handwritten, sealed with a red wax stamp. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the handwriting, Thomas's. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The letter was simple, yet it weighed heavily in Clara's hands as she read it. Clara, I don't know how to say this, but I need to. Over the last few weeks, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on where we've been, what we've been through, and who we are now. I've come to realize something that scares me. We're not the same people we once were, and maybe that's okay. But I've been holding on to the past, trying to make something work that no longer can. I love you. I always will. But we need different things now. I need to let you go, and I think you need to let me go too. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Clara. I've always tried to be your protector, your anchor. But I realize now that you don't need me in that way anymore. Maybe one day, we'll find our way back to each other. But for now, I need to walk my own path, just as you're walking yours. This isn't goodbye. It's simply the next step in our journey. I hope you can find peace in that. Thomas. Clara's hands trembled as she finished reading the letter. A mix of emotions flooded her: sadness, relief, and a deep, painful understanding. She had known this was coming, but to hear it from him, written in his own hand, made it feel all the more final. The space they had created had grown into something neither of them had expected. It wasn't just distance, it was a separation of their paths. And while she knew it was the right thing, it didn't make it any easier. Clara sat on the couch, the letter clutched in her hands. She let the tears fall, not out of sorrow, but because it felt like the end of an era. The love she had shared with Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but she knew now that it was time for both of them to move forward. The days after Thomas's letter passed in a haze. Clara went through the motions of her life, but something inside her had shifted. The weight of his absence was heavy, but at the same time, there was a quiet relief. She felt as though she had been holding her breath for so long, and now she could finally exhale. It was a lonely kind of freedom, though. She spent more time alone than she ever had before, navigating the uncharted waters of her own identity. And yet, the more she explored the solitude, the more she began to realize something. She wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. Her thoughts returned to her writing. She had started the journal months ago, but now it felt like something more. She began to put her experiences into words, her journey of healing, the pain of letting go, the quiet strength that had been there all along. With each word she wrote, she felt herself becoming more whole, more connected to who she truly was. But even in this new space, a familiar face occasionally drifted into her thoughts. A few weeks had passed since the letter, and Clara felt the pull to see Sophia. They hadn't spoken much in the last few days. Clara had needed time to herself, and Sophia had been busy with her own commitments. But now, Clara felt ready to reconnect. She drove to Sophia's house on a rainy afternoon, her thoughts swirling as the windshield wipers swished rhythmically. When she arrived, Sophia greeted her warmly, a soft smile on her face as she invited Clara inside. "I'm glad you're here," Sophia said, offering her a cup of tea. "How have you been?" Clara hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Her emotions were still raw, still shifting in unexpected ways. But something about Sophia's steady presence made her feel safe enough to speak her truth. "I've been figuring things out," Clara said slowly. "Thomas and I are no longer together. We're both healing, but it feels like the end of something. I don't know what comes next." Sophia listened carefully, her eyes understanding. She took a sip of tea and then spoke. "I think you're already on the path you need to be on, Clara. The hardest part is letting go, and you've done that. Now, the journey is about rediscovering who you are and what you want for yourself. It's about finding peace in that space." Clara nodded. She had always admired Sophia's wisdom, the way she could make the complex seem simple, the way she always seemed to understand exactly what Clara needed to hear. "I don't know what the future holds," Clara continued, "but I know that I'm not afraid anymore. I'm learning to trust myself, to trust the process." Sophia smiled. "That's the most important part. You're exactly where you need to be." As Clara left Sophia's house that evening, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. She walked to her car, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in months, Clara felt a quiet optimism for the future. She wasn't sure where her journey would take her, but she was no longer afraid to face it. Her heart was open, her mind clear, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Clara spent the next few months exploring the space she had carved out for herself. She didn't rush her healing, nor did she seek to fill the emptiness left by Thomas's departure with anyone or anything. Instead, she embraced it, letting it be a canvas for her new life. She returned to her writing, channeling her experiences into a new project, a memoir of sorts, not just about her journey of healing, but about the strength she had found in herself. She poured her heart onto the pages, and in the process, she discovered a sense of purpose she had long forgotten. And as Clara looked to the future, she realized something. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The future was hers to write,